From the top rope and the Great American Bash, I bid you all good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be in this great land of ours or around the world. Welcome to the $55 million studio on the Pro Wrestle Machine. Let's get into this issue. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. March 15, 1999 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. WWF wins Monday Night Ratings War. March 15, 1999 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. WWF wins Monday Night Ratings War. UFC 19 results, plus tons of news. The Monday Night Wars can officially be declared over. The World Wrestling Federation lost a few battles over the nearly 4 years, but has now won the war. The news story is not a competitive ratings race, but the incredible success of the World Wrestling Federation coming at the same time as what will likely become over the next few months almost a freefall-like destruction of World Championship Wrestling. The WWF set record ratings with a 5.09 for Sunday Night Heat on March 7th, followed by a 6.46 for Raw the next night, selling out both house shows over the weekend, and getting more and more merchandising and publicity appearance from its wrestlers, starting with a sable cover of Playboy, a second set of TV guide covers with Rock, Mankind, Steve Austin, and Sable, all leading into a WrestleMania show that will surely be the biggest money event in company history and the biggest non-boxing event in the history of pay-per-view. Those stories all pale in comparison to what is happening in WCW. With Eric Bischoff on vacation in France, it would be more apropos if he was in Rome playing the fiddle. Apparently for several weeks, Hulk Hogan and Kevin Nash turned the Nitro show into their personal vehicle to get themselves over, which is hardly different from bookers of the past who still perform. But what is different is the lengths they have gone to bury virtually all the talent and put on what many would say was the single worst major league promotion television show in history on March 8th. The morale of the undercard wrestlers, which has been largely bad to awful ever since the collective realization that the old guys on top are actually burying them rather than the feeling it was only their own paranoia saying so, hit rock bottom. When Bischoff, who has largely disappeared and seemingly looking for his escape off the Titanic taking water, was asked about what is so obvious, his response was that he promised Nash full control and that Nash was going to be given a chance to sink or swim on his own without interference. The show opened with 1 solid hours of video features on Hogan, Nash, Scott Steiner, Buff Bagwell, and Torrie Wilson, most of which, actually the Steiner and Buff segment where they played Boston cops was kind of funny in a perverse way, were as bad as the Eric Bischoff monologues before the Jay Leno match featuring dated references to where Nash's former gimmick of being the world's oldest street hoodlum was unmasked to be a 40-year-old man whose idea of pop culture was the circa mid-60s movie The Graduate. When coming up with a famous place kicker in pro football after Flair delivered a low kick, came up with Jim Bakken, a player from 31 seasons ago of almost no lasting fame, and whose announcing suddenly made Bobby Heenan sound relevant. But his booking made his announcing look world-class as he presented a show that had to be designed to fail because it actually takes a lot of thought to present something that bad. So at least it succeeded in that way. WCW has a history of poor booking, dating back before it was WCW when Dusty Rhodes set the pattern for what is happening today with his destruction of Jim Crockett Promotions in 1987 and 1988 after a record-setting 1986. How did he do it? Pushing himself as the top star when, despite all his success in the past, he was long since past his prime. Booking repetitive screw job finishes, particularly in the main events, leaving the audience mad, not at the heels, but at the company, when they went home from a show. And most of all, after everything else failed and the ship started to sink, over a 1-year period, he turned nearly everyone, remember this one, winding up with fans not caring about any of the personalities anymore. From 1988, when JCP went down, the company, later WCW, never got into the black until 1996. Because of merchandise, TV ad revenue and pay-per-view, it would be exceedingly difficult, even with a big payroll, for WCW to actually lose money, and with Time Warner behind it, the end result won't be the same as JCP, which was basically going to declare bankruptcy until Ted Turner, seeing shows that were drawing his station good ratings about to be canceled, bailed out the company, which is actually the true reason he got involved in owning a pro wrestling franchise and not foresight to see the future or any long-standing hatred of Vince McMahon, although the truth is never as romantic as fiction. So the next, and unfortunately final step, is desperation at the gap widening on Monday nights, is more focus on all the wrong people. Hollywood Hogan becoming a babyface and Ric Flair, at 50, becoming the lead heel in the company. And perhaps a few other turns as well. Kevin Nash of course is in bed now with Hogan, since Hogan ultimately runs the show whether he does a name or not. And he needs to turn with Hogan, as without him Hogan has no prayer of being cheered. Flair has convinced Hogan that he's the one who has so much experience at playing bad guy wrestler that he can turn Hogan back face. The final stage of the double turn is apparently scheduled for Uncensored, where in a first blood match, a stipulation that Eric Bischoff will not allow to be spoken on television because the words blood are banned from WCW television. However, they can still use blood, blade and do a first blood match, so it's a case of doing a stipulation match in a pay-per-view main event where the stipulation itself can't be set on TV, but a stipulation that allows Hogan to lose the title to Flair. Has an easy screw job ending where Flair bleeds first but the ref doesn't see it, and where Hogan won't have to job to Flair, somehow win in a screw job, getting the title. Exactly what all the plans are aren't clear, probably because they haven't been formulated. Scott Hall appears to be out of the picture, although he was also planned for a face turn. Hall has been talking of sitting out for a while and suing WCW since it was a WCW employee who ran over his ankle on February 21st in Oakland, and he's definitely going to be out of action for the time being. Chris Benoit, Dean Malenko and Steve McMichael will become forgotten. The ultimate burial of Bret Hart is already complete, finishing off with plans of his purgatory being put in a mid-card trio with Barry Windham and Kurt Hennig as traditionalist second-generation wrestlers. Read that the grumpy old men, that nobody cares about whether they have good matches or not. Arn Anderson, possibly after being turned on, will be phased off television, as in today's wrestling, there is no use for a guy who just happens to be one of the three best promo men in a business where promos have never been more important. Billy Kidman, who has superstar potential that anyone could see, is almost eliminated from television. Juventud Guerrera, the single best wrestler in the United States, or at least the wrestler who over the last 6 months of the year along with Kidman were having the most consistent excellent matches, has also been almost completely erased from view. Conan, who was getting over almost to a shocking degree before his recent recipient of the erasure treatment, has a video that never stops playing and a career that never starts up. Chris Jericho, who people in the profession compare to a young Ric Flair or the next Shawn Michaels, is booked as if he's the next Tracy Smothers. Remember Wrath, or Canyon, or Raven? I didn't think so. It appears Scott Steiner, Buff Bagwell and Lex Luger will remain heels and align themselves with Flair as the top heel group and be protected, along with Torrie Wilson, since today more than ever, sex sells. Bill Goldberg, because he is such a phenom, will be kept strong, but not too strong if he and Hogan are on the same battling for the top face spot. It won't be long before he's asked to turn. As far as everyone else in the company, it's pretty clear the future is no future. A few lessons were learned in the first hour of Nitro. Fans are not going to tune out of Nitro in droves no matter how bad the first hour is. Before the Leno match, when Bischoff did his terrible monologues, if they were in the first hour, there was no tune-out factor. That couldn't be said if they were in the head-to-head period. Nitro opened stronger than usual, which should lead to a big rating show. The first hour failed to grow at the usual rate, but it still didn't fall. Of course there was the big drop when Raw went on the air, but it was no greater than usual. Although an angle involving Goldberg and Flair may have prevented a freefall quarter and the Raven Bigelow Hawk three-way did well. WCW got destroyed by Raw over the next 75 minutes, although perhaps it was the lure of Flair versus Goldberg, or perhaps something else, but the destruction was slightly less than it was last week or during the horrible show from Tampa on February 15th. Although Raw never trailed and set its all-time record, it was clearly Flair versus Goldberg that saved an embarrassment from being any worse. In the final quarter hour before the main event, with Raw built around women teasing taking their clothes off, a woman ripping another woman's shirt off leaving her in her bra, and a crucifixion, Raw did its highest quarter hour in history and second biggest ever for the Monday Night Wars, trailing only the 7.23 for the Goldberg vs. Page replay of the pay-per-view match, which was cut off in many systems, a 6.98, more than doubling Nitro. WCW countered in the semifinal position with Bret Hart against, of all people, Van Hammer, in a match which went 10:45 when it is already clear that long matches except as a main event or with two big names against each other are death in a competitive period, which did a 3.48 tying the greatest quarter-hour margin in history. Flair vs. Goldberg showed remarkable growth, doing a 4.64 final quarter and a 5.73 overrun, still losing to Austin vs. Mankind on Raw, which did drop a full point to a 5.98 final quarter and a 6.14 overrun. The finish of both shows drew a combined rating of close to a 12 and a combined share of more than 21. Raw's record 6.46 rating was composed of a 6.47 first hour and a 6.44 seconds hour, with its other ratings peaked during for the Jim Ross angle, 6.97 rating, making it the highest rated pure angle in the history of Monday Night Television. The Ross angle was easily the best thing on either show for the night. The show also set its all-time record, doing its first 10.0 share in history over more than 2 hours. Nitro finished with a 4.40 rating, 4.95 first hour, 4.11 seconds hour, 4.13 third hour, and a 6.6 share, with the Raven/Hawk/Bigelow three-way backstage brawl being the second best drawing segment at 4.5. In comparing demos over the head-to-head, 2 hours and 5 minutes saw Raw drew the largest audience in its history, 7,265,000 viewers to Nitro's 4,662,500 viewers. In men 18 to 24, Raw drew 650,000 viewers to 306,000, 68% for Raw. Men 25 to 54 had Raw with 1,921,000 viewers to Nitro's 1,658,000, 54% Raw. Men 55 plus had Raw with 419,000 to Nitro's 349,000, 55% Raw. And it's really sad for Nitro headlining with the older stars from the past to not even carry this demo, which really speaks for how bad the show was. Women 18 to 24 saw Raw with 351,000 viewers and Nitro with 91,000, 79% Raw in a demo that Nitro dominated strongly last year. Women 25 to 54 saw Raw with 945,000 viewers to Nitro's 689,000. 58% Raw. And women 55 plus saw Nitro with 372,000 viewers to Raw's 329,000, 53% Nitro. Ages 2 to 11 saw Raw with 960,000 viewers to Nitro's 672,000, 59% Raw. And ages 12 to 27 saw Raw with 1,490,000 viewers to Nitro's 525,000, 74% Raw. The goals of Hogan and Nash have always been transparent, none more so than they are now. At one point, even Hogan's self-serving interests also wound up being the company's best interests. Even though Flair himself requested the turn because he's more comfortable due to his patterned style of doing the begging and the patented bumps of working in a heel role, and got his wish because it fit into Hogan's agenda, Flair can't maintain his ratings drawing power at the age of 50 in a heel role. Facing Goldberg for the first time will be the exception that proves the rule. The idea that the company, which is falling at least partially due to public perception because of its image as being the old man's company, would build the top heel position around a 50-year-old and try and market Hogan and Nash as the cool young hip babyfaces is a recipe for disaster that any blind man could see, but it does serve singular agendas of the top guys in charge well if the goal is to keep themselves strong for when they also abandon ship. So the question becomes, how long does this go on? Judging from the history of this company, a long time. How much damage will be done before changes are made? Far more now than ever. There is one huge difference between Jim Crockett Promotions of 1988 and World Championship Wrestling of 1999. Even if WCW is better equipped, financially survive no matter how bad a product it puts out. In JCP of 1988, morale was bad, but mentally, the performers didn't quit and still put on very good shows. In 1999, everyone, and I mean just about everyone, from the wrestlers, to the announcers, to the front office, has mentally quit. It's horrible. There's nothing that anyone thinks can be done because any good idea is shot down, and has been shot down for months because it might get the wrong person over. Take the money. Don't worry and don't get ulcers over it seems to be the only attitude to survive the job other than major doses of mind-numbing medication. Those who signed recently wish they hadn't. Those with the chance to go elsewhere almost surely will. None of this was the case in JCP of 1988. And history also showed that even though the WCW of 1989 was not financially successful, it was one of the best years when it came to producing a strong product, of any company over the last decade. There was damage down and a perception problem and numerous other problems when it came to overall booking in those days. Does anyone feel that, even with a far stronger talent base, that the WCW of 1999 will rebound inside the ring this year? This game is over. Vader became the first wrestler in history to win both the New Japan IWGP Heavyweight title and the All Japan Triple Crown when he pinned Akira Taue to win the vacant latter belt before a sellout 16,300 fans at Tokyo Budokan Hall. With the win, Vader adds to his list of being perhaps, with the possible exception of Lou Thesz, the man who has held more different major league versions of the World Heavyweight title than any wrestler who ever lived. Vader's first version of the world title, under the name Bull Power Leon White, came in 1987 when he captured the first of his 3 Catch Wrestling Association, Austria/Germany, belts from Otto Wanz. While that belt today would no longer be considered a major league world title, At the time it was the biggest championship in Europe and White drew some large gates as champion there feuding with Wands. Since that win, Vader has also held the UWA World Heavyweight title one time, at the time when it was the leading promotion in Mexico, the IWGP title 3 times, at one point in 1990. He held the CWA, UWA and IWGP title at the same time, which probably made him the first wrestler in history to hold the major versions of the world title on 3 different continents at the same time. The WCW title 3 times and the UWFI Luthez belt once, before this being his 12th world title reign. With the win, it was pretty much made official that the April 2nd Tokyo Dome show will be headlined by Vader defending the title against Mitsuharu Misawa in their first ever title match, although the two will wrestle in a singles match for the first time on March 28 in Nagoya as part of the Champion Carnival Tour. The Budokan show also featured the retirement ceremony for Jumbo Tsuruta, with him playing Frank Sinatra singing My Way. The ceremony was said to be something of a disappointment, as it was less elaborate than New Japan's ceremony on February 14 in the same building for Masa Saito, and Tsuruta was a far bigger star than Saito. NTV will be holding a television special on March 15 to commemorate the career of Tsuruta. Reports are it was a good show overall, with the semifinal being the best match on the show, where Kenta Kobashi and Jun Akiyama retained the double tag team titles, beating Misawa and Yoshinari Ogawa in 30-59 when Akiyama pinned Ogawa after his favorite exploder suplex. The Triple Crown title, won by Toshiaki Kawada over Misawa on January 22 in Osaka, was immediately vacated when Kawada broke his forearm during the match. Kawada was scheduled to lose the title to Vader on March 6, which put All Japan in something of a booking bind because they wanted to save Misawa versus Vader for the Dome show, and Vader had already pinned Kobashi, so they didn't want a rematch so soon. They had Kawada nominate Taue, his tag partner, for the title match at Budokan, while Vader got the shot he earned by beating Kobashi on January 15 in Yokohama. The match aired the next night on television. Vader opened the matches with punches before Taue used a brainbuster. Vader did a release German suplex, the same move he did in his famous Tokyo Dome match against Antonio Inoki, and Taue rolled out of the ring. Taue came back, sending Vader into the post and giving him a kick. The match went back and forth for the next several minutes. The finishing sequence started with Vader doing 2 choke slams and throwing Taue out of the ring, where he splashed him. Vader used 2 Vader bombs, called Big Van Crush in Japan, and continued to dominate in the ring, winning after a power bomb at 12:51. Stan Hansen, who should have an asterisk by the title of holding the major title in both All Japan and New Japan during his career, he held the NWF title in 1980, which at the time wasn't considered a world heavyweight title but was the lead singles belt in New Japan, as at the time New Japan was part of the National Wrestling Alliance, and held every major singles title in the All Japan organization during his career. Riki Choshu also held the PWF title, one of the 3 belts which combined into the Triple Crown in 1989, in 1986, and held the IWGP title on numerous occasions, but the PWF title also was never considered as the World Heavyweight title by All Japan, since at the time All Japan was still an NWA member. UFC 19 entitled Young Guns, on March 5 before a sellout 1,700 fans at Casino Magic in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, will probably be more remembered for what wasn't on the show than what was. Inside the Octagon, the show ended with 2 names coming out as major stars, both of whom could probably be entitled Young Guns, both powerful amateur wrestlers who can also box: Kevin Randleman and Pedro Tito Ortiz. Both used their physical strength superiority to dominate veterans with a lot more credentials in the fight world, Maurice Smith and Guy Mesger respectively, to put each at the top of the contenders list for the heavyweight and middleweight titles. Randleman, a former NCAA champion from Ohio State and a personal protege and best friend of Mark Coleman, simply had too much strength for Smith, the former EFC and UFC World Heavyweight Champion, in winning a unanimous decision after 15 minutes in a match to determine the opponent for Boss Rutan on the April 7th show to fill the heavyweight title, which has been vacated since Randy Couture left the organization last October. Ortiz, who wrestled at Cal State Bakersfield and has trained in boxing under Al Stanka, who has worked with such names as Oscar de la Hoya and Vitor Belfort, physically dominated Mesger to avenge a previous loss which was somewhat controversial. Mesger had been the king of Pancrase before vacating the title a few weeks back to take this fight. Ortiz won when ref John McCarthy stopped the match in 9:58. The way the middleweight title picture seems to look at this point, the feeling is they will probably attempt to match USWF champ Evan Tanner, who scored a one-sided win on the undercard over former Bulgarian Sama champ Valery Ignatov, against either Belfort or Ortiz on the April 7th show, and have the winner of that match face the odd man out of this situation, Most likely Ortiz, although matchmaker John Peretti on television was talking about an Ortiz versus Tanner match, who has a bad hand and elbow, would face the winner of a Belfort versus Tanner match over the summer, although at this point anything is little more than speculation, with the survivor from all that meeting Frank Shamrock for the title in the late summer or early fall. Semaphore Entertainment Group had taped an interview with Frank Shamrock earlier in the week for the show where he talked about returning and defending the title in the late summer after getting married. Even though the matches were short and they were constantly stretching time, the piece didn't air. But the show will probably be best remembered for an incident that didn't even take place on camera aside for a split second and was never really acknowledged to the home viewing audience between Ortiz and Ken Shamrock. After Ortiz beat Mesger, he took both hands and right on camera, did the double Steve Austin salute right at Shamrock and the rest of the members of the Lion's Den. Shamrock has had two proteges in a row, Jerry Bullender in January being the other, fall to Ortiz, both of which at least based on credentials going in would have had to have been considered upsets. Ortiz was definitely given a chance ahead of time with Bullender but was clearly the underdog. After the win over Bullender, Ortiz established his name and many expected him to beat Mesger, but Mesger did come into the match with more credentials. Ortiz is a one-time sparring partner of Tank Abbott, who now trains with John LeBay in UFC, is now nicknamed the Bad Boy from Huntington Beach, a nickname formerly given to Abbott. After his win, Ortiz then pulled out a t-shirt that read Guy Mesger, a name he called Guy Mesger when he saw him at a weigh-in for his fight in January, is my bitch, one of a few derogatory t-shirts Ortiz had brought to the show. As he was about to put the shirt on, Shamrock screamed at him that if he put the shirt on, he'd rip his head off his shoulders. John Peretti, at ringside doing commentary, said look at the shirt, while the cameras panned away so the shirt was never visible to the public. Shamrock, infuriated by what he felt, and rightly so, was poor sportsmanship and a lack of showing respect, got really hot. He screamed basically right in Ortiz's face, "I thought you had more respect than that. I thought you had balls. If you put the t-shirt on, I'll rip your head off." Ortiz responded that he did have balls, and it was all just a game. Even before this happened, both Shamrock and Mesger appeared on television to be a little hot at McCarthy for stopping the fight. After the stoppage, Mesger got up and complained. Shamrock told McCarthy that if he thought his fighter was in trouble he would have thrown in the towel. McCarthy explained he just couldn't let a fighter take so many blows without defending himself. Ortiz wasn't delivering terrible damage to Mesger at the time the fight was stopped, although Mesger was open to it in his position, simply because he also was very tired by this point. Shamrock didn't say anything at the show, but after viewing the tape was also upset that Ortiz threw elbows to the back of the head during the fight, which are against UFC rules since every rule change in some form changes the nature of the fight and what you feel the need to defend. The finishing sequence saw Mesger locked underneath face down. Mesger took 12 punches and 2 elbows to the back of the head, the elbows being illegal under UFC rules, before trying to escape by going for the leg and getting the move blocked. At this point Ortiz threw another 20 punches and 2 elbows, with Mesger offering minimal resistance and not moving before McCarthy stopped the fight. Mesger at the finish seemed almost lucky in that Ortiz also seemed pretty well exhausted, so his blows weren't as damaging as they could have been to a relatively stationary target. Shamrock started screaming at Ortiz about the shirt off. There was a lot of divisiveness on this issue, including some who thought Ortiz should have been punished for poor sportsmanship. Mesger had run down Ortiz in a pre-fight interview, and of course, Ortiz had done somewhat the same as well, which made the match into a grudge match with at least a lot of anticipation on the inside. Some defended Ortiz, saying that Mesger had talked smack before the fight and Ortiz was simply talking smack back after the win. Either way, as far as hyping future business, what would at one time been considered bad sportsmanship is, and whether that is good or bad is another issue, does work today to getting someone over with an attitude, as even a casual observer of today's sports scene, let alone pro wrestling, can see. Whether that was the intent here is a different story, and certainly it wasn't taken as such by Shamrock. Shamrock during the week spoke with Bob Marowitz at Semaphore Entertainment Group about a third Ortiz-Mesger match, since they are 1-1. But this wasn't a planned angle and the emotions were real. For Ortiz to make a name, being the other end of a grudge that would set up Shamrock to return to UFC against him, or simply to just have his name linked with Shamrock due to his celebrity status, may be the best way possible. And even if Shamrock would want to face Ortiz to avenge his fighter's losses, and Shamrock was not even talking about such a match, feeling if he were to come back he'd want to challenge the winner of Rudin versus Randleman for the heavyweight title, and logic would say the best time for such a fight would be if when UFC gets full or close to full cable penetration, and those in Semaphore Entertainment Group are talking confidently about a breakthrough being imminent which would put the sport back on the map. There is still the matter of his WWF contract. Shamrock has talked with Vince McMahon and Jim Ross about the situation and has no plans on leaving the WWF, but would like to fight if they were to allow it, possibly in 6 to 8 months. Whether UFC would or wouldn't want Shamrock to walk in and challenge for the title, particularly given the question as to how often if ever they could get him back for title defenses, bring up another potential can of worms if things got that far. UFC is so afraid of anything negative on their shows, and there was more than a little swearing by excited fighters who have had little television time doing interviews, that they pulled the cameras away from almost all of the Shamrock-Ortiz controversy. And Ortiz did add more fuel to the fire in a post-match television interview where he talked about beating 2 of Ken's alley cats and sending them back to the litter. And he added more fuel later when asked in the dressing room if he'd fight Shamrock, said he'd be willing if Shamrock would take a drug test. While this was going on, the UFC was airing a replay of the finish of the match, but Shamrock was screaming so loud you could hear his voice while the replay was going on. When the replay ended, Ortiz was right at the side of the octagon in Shamrock's face, and Shamrock was climbing the octagon with others trying to pull him down and the cage door having been locked to keep Shamrock out. At this point, McCarthy basically dragged Ortiz to his own corner while Shamrock and the other members of the Lions' Den at octagon side remained infuriated. After airing a split second of this, the cameras pulled away again airing crowd shots, which actually were the back of Ken's father Bob who came out of the dressing room to see what was going on, while Shamrock and the Lions' Den members were furious about what they considered disrespect. Abbott himself officially withdrew from the show just 2 days beforehand claiming a flu. There had been rumors for a week leading up to the show that Abbott would not appear, although Abbott had trained himself down to his lowest body weight in years, said to be near 230, so at one point he must have been serious about taking the fight. With no lead time to get anyone, John Peretti brought in Andre Roberts, a 370-pound Indian who was 7-0 in Extreme Challenge in one UFC match and as of late had been doing pro wrestling matches for Eddie Sharkey in the Midwest. He was clearly not in shape for someone the caliber of Goodridge, and the match was over, literally almost before it started, leading to Goodridge to issue an off-camera challenge to Boss Rutten, who was at ringside watching the match. UFC officially announced on this show that they will be doing a pay-per-view called Ultimate Ken Shamrock on April 2nd, airing both old and new interviews and clips of Shamrock's 10 UFC matches before joining the WWF. The show also featured extensive hype for a Rutten vs. Randleman title match, with Rutten basically admitting that any form of kicks except to the head, one of his strongest tactics, wouldn't be used because every time Smith tried them, he wound up being taken down. Randleman, who has a 6-2 record in MMA, mainly in Brazil where he won once and placed second in 2 other tournaments. Randleman has incredible athletic ability with one of those genetically freaky physiques, almost like you'd see in a high-level bodybuilder combined with tremendous quickness and agility. And the real shocker watching him is that most wrestlers or men with that type of physique tend to tire in long fights for the various obvious reasons, and Randleman seemed to have the endurance of a marathon runner and bragged before the fight that he was in shape to throw 3,000 punches. Those attributes will make it very difficult for a man smaller than him like Rutten to win based on how they match up, although if Randleman gets as cocky as he was with Smith and decides to stand and exchange punches with him, it will be dangerous for him in the long run. Rutten is a good defensive fighter on the ground, but he can be taken down, and was regularly in his first UFC fight, and Randleman is far quicker and more explosive when it comes to takedowns than Tsuyoshi Kosaka. On the other hand, Rutten has not lost a fight in 4 years against some top-caliber opponents, and that's no kind of record that can be easily dismissed. If he can land the lucky shot, either a knockout flurry or a kick to the knee, such as which in reality was the difference in the Kosaka match, he can win. And a submission isn't impossible, but he can't match power with Randleman, and if the fight goes any length, he will be taken down. Randleman had no fear of standing and punching even with a legendary striker like Smith. Shamrock's prediction is that Rutten will win, probably with a submission or possibly with a knockout kick, believing that Randleman left himself open for a submission and that Rutten is better on the ground than Smith and throws stronger punches and kicks if Randleman decides to stand with him. Although he is not an experienced boxer, he exhibited no fear standing against Smith and in staying on his feet for 4 minutes, took no serious punishment. His lack of fear could have been his Achilles heel against Smith, as several times when he had Smith on the ground, he would allow him back to his feet in order to take him down again, but Smith never had him in trouble. His 2 MMA losses, both suffered a few years back in Brazil, were via a triangle choke after a 20 minutes match against Carlos Barreto, and a devastating knockout loss to Tom Erickson, who probably outweighed him by 70 pounds and was a superior wrestler. Sion Latu beat Joey Roberts in the dark opening match. Latu, who is the younger brother of the Barbarian, and wrestled pro under the name John Savage and fought once in rings, losing a shoot match to Kosaka, wound up breaking Roberts' nose with a punch and the blood was coming out like a water faucet and the match was stopped in 10 minutes. This was said to have been a very even back-and-forth exciting match until the finish. When the first match was in the ring, the mat was stained from what appeared to be a large puddle of Roberts' blood. In fact, Latu was covered in blood himself and it wasn't his blood. 1. Pete Williams 5-1, beat Jason Godsey 4-4, in 155 with a knee bar submission. Williams, from Lion's Den, with Shamrock in his corner, took Godsey, who has experience fighting in both the US, Brazil and Japan, Pancrase down and hit him with a lot of hard body punches while caught in the guard, and dominated the groundwork before maneuvering into the knee bar submission. Williams looked impressive. 2. Evan Tanner, 4-0, beat Valery Ignatov, 0-1, in 258 via ref stoppage. Ignatov seemed very comfortable on the ground as far as maneuvering positions, but from Samba and being in his first fight under these rules wasn't experienced in protecting his head. Tanner rocked Ignatov with hard punches on the ground, and to Ignatov's credit, he didn't seem to register. They had a ground scramble with both going for leg locks before Tanner got out and started throwing more punches from the mount with Ignatov not defending himself, and then Tanner started throwing brutal-looking elbows one after the other from the mount to the face before the ref stopped the fight. 3. Kevin Randleman 6-2 beat Maurice Smith 3-2 by a unanimous decision after 15 minutes to earn heavyweight title shot. The prevailing wisdom at Semaphore Entertainment Group going in was that this fight was to set up Smith versus Rutten, but you never know how these things play out in real life. The first 2 minutes were the two dancing without throwing. Smith threw a few leg kicks and Randleman threw a few punches. Randleman finally took Smith down off a leg kick and Smith went into a TK guard. Randleman threw some serious punches from the top, although Smith never seemed that fazed since he's experienced in taking blows. The action slowed and McCarthy ordered a stand-up, but Randleman took Smith down again and was giving him a little beating. Smith got away once but Randleman took him down immediately. Smith went for a keylock submission but Randleman was too powerful for him to lock it. In the overtime, Randleman took Smith down again off a kick. Randleman twice led him up in overtime, only to take him down again immediately, and finished with a flurry of punches leaving Smith's left eye almost totally swollen shut. 4. Jeremy Horn, 15-4-2 beat Chuck Little via referee stoppage in 12 minutes. This was an even match most of the way but the crowd didn't seem interested in it. It was mainly wrestling with a few punches thrown. Little seemed ahead in the first half and then started to tire, where Horn took over. While Horn was on top, he didn't do much and it was a dull match. Just as regulation was ending, Horn started squeezing with a reverse choke and time expired. As Horn got up, Little was laying on the mat out, although he hadn't tapped, from the choke and the match was stopped. 5. Gary Goodridge, 10-7, beat Andre Roberts 7-1, in 45 seconds. Goodridge threw a few leg kicks and a few punches, none of which looked devastating and one of which landed on the nose. Roberts, who seemed totally outclassed, probably because he wasn't in conditioning take the fight on 2 days' notice, simply turned his back and quit, apparently suffering a broken nose. Goodridge started throwing a verbal challenge to Boss Rutten while leaving ringside. At some point during the fight, Goodridge either got hit or bit through his bottom lip as he wound up going to the hospital and needing stitches. 6. Tito Ortiz 3-1 beat Guy Mesger 4-1 by a referee stoppage in 9:58. This was the best match on the show. Ortiz physically overpowered Mesger, mostly taking him down and using his long arms to punch him from the top in occasional flurries. Mesger seemed to tire early. Mesger went for several submissions from the bottom including a straight armbar about 4 minutes which he came close with but was in a bad leverage position with and Ortiz broke. Mesger was constantly looking for the arm while on the bottom and another time had a better leverage position but Ortiz powered his way out. Ortiz continued to punch and elbow Mesger while down, and a lot of the elbows appear to be behind the head which are illegal. With both men seemingly physically spent, Mesger was trapped underneath when going for a leg lock and Ortiz threw punches and elbows at the back of his head. Once again, elbows to that spot are illegal but there was no warning before McCarthy stopped the fight. The career of Lizmark, one of Mexican wrestling's all-time legends, has apparently come to a sudden end due to heart problems at the age of 49. The real-life Juan Baños Sr., who had missed several bookings over the past several weeks due to feeling under the weather, was admitted to the coronary care unit of El Hospital de Cardiología in Mexico City after feeling chest pains while backstage at a show on March 3 in Acapulco. About the only information reported in Ovaciones quoted promoter Ricardo Reyes, a close friend of Baños, a saying that the doctors told him he could absolutely never wrestle again because they considered going back to the ring a life-threatening risk. Lismark, one of innovators and pioneers of out-of-the-ring dives in Mexico, had been used by many in recent years as proof that the perceived dangers of the style didn't match up to the reality. He wrestled professionally for 23 years and never suffered a serious injury, even though he for 2 decades did one of the most amazing planches in the sport on a regular basis. He remained as a top worker into his early 40s, although he had clearly slowed down in recent years, since it's basically impossible for a wrestler who relies on high-flying moves as their gimmick to remain over-strong without changing their style into their 40s. His son, Juan Baños Jr., is currently wrestling in WCW as Lismark Jr. Lismark had talked in recent months of retiring from wrestling voluntarily, and had stuck around because he wanted to wrestle his retirement match as a tag team match with his son at Arena Mexico at the time when it appeared WCW and EMLL would be working together before the deal fell through. Juan Baños grew up in Acapulco and was originally on American television in the 60s and 70s when television shows such as ABC's Wide World of Sports would air cliff diving from Acapulco segments showing young Mexican teenagers diving 180 feet into the water. Baños had given up cliff diving at the age of 26 and moved to pro wrestling as a means to support his family. His oldest son was born in 1972, debuting in April of 1976 in his hometown under the name Bismarck, the name of a warship that was docked in Acapulco. His name was changed to Lismark so they could design an animal mask and gimmick for him. He gained notoriety fast as being one of the best and most graceful of the new breed of high-flying innovative wrestlers in Mexico at the time, pioneering the style that gained popularity first in Mexico and Japan, and later worldwide, over the next decade. He captured his first major title, the Mexican National Welterweight title, at his home arena Coliseo in Acapulco, a building which he was the big star in for most of the next 2 decades, on April 18, 1979 from Americo Rocca, before losing it back to Rocca on March 29, 1980. The loss set him up for bigger things: the NWA World Welterweight title, which he won on June 4, 1980 in the same building from the late Supremo I, holding that strap until October 23, 1981, losing to La Fiera in Mexico City. He moved up to the Mexican National Middleweight title, beating his biggest career rival, El Satánico, on February 19, 1982 in Mexico City, the first of 2 title reigns with that belt. Lismark's first reign with what could be argued as the most prestigious belt in all of Mexican wrestling, considering all the legends from Santo de Rey Mendoza to Pero Aguayo to Rayo de Jalisco to Satoru Sayama and Gory Guerrero that held at the NWA World Middleweight belt, came when he beat Satánico on June 3, 1983 in Mexico City. At the time he held the national title, which he vacated upon winning the world title. Satánico regained the title on December 2, 1983 in Mexico City. He then moved up to the light heavyweight division, capturing that NWA World title from Cien Caras on March 20, 1988 in Mexico City, and held that title on 4 occasions, feuding with the likes of Satánico, Fabuloso Blondie, Ken Timbs, and Pirata Morgan, and also held the WWA World Light Heavyweight title on and off for 10 years. Lismark left EMLL to work for AAA in 1992, soon capturing the Mexican National Light Heavyweight title from Universo 2000 and held the title for 2 years before losing to La Parca in the latter's first major championship win in Mexico. Lismark returned to EMLL in 1995 and in recent years captured the new CMLL middleweight belt from Satánico and held the CMLL tag team titles with Atlantis before jumping briefly to Promo Azteca, and then quickly returning. Lismark owned one of the most famous masks in the history of Mexican wrestling, and that legacy from his father is the main reason his son has continually spurned suggestions from WCW that he lost his mask, which is among the reasons his son never gets a push. Mexico. EMLL is building to a major show 319 at Arena Mexico to honor both El Santo and Salvador Lutteroth, who are the biggest name wrestler and biggest name promoter respectively in Mexican wrestling history, headlined by a hair/mask versus hair/mask match with El Hijo del Santo and Negro Casas versus Bestia Salvaje and Scorpio Jr. The match was set up on March 5 with Emilio Charles Jr. and Santo and Casas beating Salvaje and Blue Panther and Fuerza Guerrera via DQ when Scorpio Jr. did a run-in and destroyed Santo's mask. On this week's EMLL television, they showed Rayo de Jalisco Jr. going in for back surgery and talked like he would be out of action for 8 months. WWF's Max Mini, who wrestled in EMLL as Mini Rey Mysterio Jr., due to all the pub regarding Mysterio Jr. losing his mask and it not being taken very favorably in Mexico, has changed his ring name to Zuki. AAA held its annual Rey de Reyes, King of Kings, tournament on March 7 at El Toreo in Naucalpan with Cibernetico, who won the 1997 tournament, beating Latin Lover, who won in 1998, in the finals in a four corners match that also included octagon and electroshock. All four had won four corners matches earlier in the show to reach the final match. The originally planned main event, a hair versus mask match with heavy metal versus kickboxer, was changed a few days before the show into what was billed as a wrestlers versus kickboxers cage match and moved lower on the show. My presumption is that whoever was supposed to lose in the singles match balked, possibly Heavy, who has backed out in every situation where they want him to lose his hair in the past. It wound up with the kickboxers winning as the team of kickboxer and Thai boxer and Gladiador Gutierrez and Guerrero Tigre Silva beat Metal and La Parca Jr. and Mascara Sagrada Jr. and Pero Oguayo Jr. in a match that got over Big Live. Los Vados Locos beat Los Vipers to keep the 8-man titles. That match ended with Cibernetico attacking Los Vipers for losing the match, and then a second guy in a Cibernetico mask ran in and made the save. He unmasked, revealing Connect. Let's see, how would that prove anything? Couldn't anyone who wore a fake Cibernetico mask also wear a fake Connect mask? I know wrestling isn't meant for anything more than first response emotion and not for thinking. The final match on the show was three-way chain match with Sangre Chicana, Pero Aguayo and Cobarde, with the loser, who turned out to be Cobarde, losing his hair. Kickboxer did beat Heavy Metal on February 28 in Monterrey in what was billed as a street fight kickboxing match with a fourth-round knockout. All Japan. There is some quiet power struggle going on for control between Mitsuharu Misawa and Motoko Baba. Mitsuo Momota, who is working as the intermediary, is kind of running the office while Misawa is trained for the position. It will be Misawa's company at some point, but Mrs. Baba understands aspects of the business that nobody else has been exposed to and wants to oversee everything Misawa does, while he wants to be left alone. The key in her favor is she has the kind of money to fund the business if it gets weak, which Misawa doesn't. There have been no discussions at this point about bringing in WWF talent for the Tokyo Dome, at least with WWF, although Misawa himself expressed interest in using the Road Warriors, which would probably be no problem since WWF isn't even using them, but it also shows how out of touch Misawa is with American wrestling as compared with the Japanese fans, since Raw now appears on cable. Many of the foreign stars are naturally worried about what the future holds without Shohei Baba, but Misawa assured all of them that everything as it regards them is going to stay the same. Besides the two title matches, the rest of the 3/6 Budokan Hall show was just the names filling out the card. Third from the top was a six-man with Johnny Ace and Wolf Hockfield and Johnny Smith over Gary Albright and Giant Kimala 2 and Yoshihiro Takayama in 21-31 when Smith pinned Kimala after a released German suplex. Smith better have had a great match, because that's an awfully long match with 5 other guys who wouldn't be high on the great worker list. For TV, the 3/7 show aired the Vader Taue match and the Jumbo Tsuruta retirement ceremony. 3/14 will air the tag title match, and there will be a 1-hour special on March 15th running down the career of Tsuruta, which actually should be pretty good because Tsuruta had tons of excellent matches during his career. As it turns out, the Champion Carnival tournament is going back to its original format. There was talk of breaking it up into 2 blocks with the winner from each side meeting in the championship. Instead, they are going to the traditional format, with the major news being that Stan Hansen will not be in the tournament for the first time in modern history. Hansen, who turns 50 this summer, without question the biggest name foreign star in the history of Japanese wrestling, was not announced as being on this tour, although there was a television report on March 8 that said Hansen would be on the tour but not in the tournament. The Japanese are into protection of the reputation of legends, a symbolic deal that may come out of the culture and be a part of sumo, or may come from sumo. The basic deal is a sumo grand champion, which is the highest level, is basically forced into retirement at the time he's no longer competitive at the top level, sparing a legendary fighter from the indignity of losing to lower-ranked fighters, something that clearly doesn't happen in our culture with boxers. It's clear the decision is that they can no longer keep Hansen competitive in the tournament, and rather than having him lose to guys that aren't being groomed for the top, lower-level wrestlers than Jun Akiyama, and looking bad in such a physically grueling tour with all the singles matches, that they would spare his legendary status the embarrassment. The tournament will have Misawa, Kobashi, Kiritaue, Akiyama, Jinsei Shinzaki, Vader, Johnny Ace, Takao Omori, Gary Albright, and Yoshihiro Takayama, meaning each wrestler will do 9 tournament matches. Lineup announced for the major shows are 3/26 at Korakuen Hall, Taue vs Akiyama, Misawa vs Shinzaki, 3/27 at Korakuen Hall, Vader vs Ace, Kobashi vs Omori, Takayama vs Albright, 3/28 in Nagoya, Misawa vs Vader, Omori vs Takayama, 3/29 in Fukui, Misawa vs Albright, Taue vs Ace, 3:30 in Kanazawa, Akiyama vs. Vader, Amori vs. Albright, Takayama vs. Ace, 3:31 in Niigata, Misawa vs. Kobashi, Taue vs. Amori, Shinzaki vs. Ace, April 2nd in Okayama, Misawa vs. Akiyama, Kobashi vs. Takayama, Shinzaki vs. Vader, April 4th in Hiroshima, Kobashi vs. Akiyama, Vader vs. Albright, Misawa vs. Amori, April 5th in Okada, Taue vs. Kobashi, Akiyama vs. Takayama, Shinzaki vs. Albright, April 6th in Kumamoto, Taue vs. Vader, Kobashi vs. Shinzaki, Amori vs. Ace, April 8th in Osaka, Vader vs. Kobashi, Misawa vs. Ace, Taue vs. Shinzaki, April 9th in Shizuoka, Misawa vs. Taue, Akiyama vs. Albright, Takayama vs. Shinzaki, April 11th at Karakuen Hall, Kobashi vs. Ace, Takayama vs. Vader, Akiyama vs. Amori, and April 14th in Morioka, Kobashi vs. Albright, Misawa vs. Takayama, Akiyama vs. Shinzaki, with the top 2-point getters going to the Budokan Hall Finals on April 16th. Albright, Takayama, and Amori are going to form a regular trio to feud with Kobashi and Akiyama and Kentaro Shiga, Misawa and Yoshinari Ogawa and Masahito Kakihara, Hansen and Vader and Monokia Mossman, Ace and Smith and Hockfield, etc. February 28 TV did a 4.1 rating. New Japan. 2 more matches were announced for the April 10th Tokyo Dome show, Atsushi Onita vs. Masahiro Chono in the electric barbed wire dynamite match and Minoru Tanaka of Battlerts vs. Tatsuhito Takaiwa. They are doing an angle where Onita said he wouldn't be appearing at the Dome and would be building his barbed wire electrified ring for his own show that day in a suburb of Tokyo at the Ariake Rainbow Stage and challenged Chono to meet him there. The plan is for the Onita-Chono match to be the opener at the Dome. They also announced that Shinya Hashimoto would not be appearing on the card. Hashimoto underwent some major nasal reconstructive surgery after problems stemming from the punches to the face from Naoya Ogawa in their now legendary match on January 4th and apparently still isn't ready to return. Reports we're hearing is that there is more interest in the All Japan Dome show on May 2nd because of the celebration for Baba, and it's figured that show will sell out than this show even with it being more heavily gimmick-oriented. Riki Choshu during the week actually announced he would be coming out of retirement, which has raised a lot of eyebrows about the financial condition of the company. Choshu, when he retired on January 4, 1998, said that he would never come back unless the company was in such bad shape that they needed him. While rumors have spread about New Japan's condition, those close to the situation deny any problems, pointing to the fact that they were able to give nearly every wrestler big raises when they signed their new deals, and that with the success of last year's 2 Dome shows, the Choshu retirement and the Inoki retirement, that business revenues were substantially up from the previous year. However, spot show business this year has declined, with both Hashimoto and Chono missing most of the shows. Choshu said he would return and wrestle on rare small shows and not big shows, in cities where neither Chono nor Hashimoto would be appearing, because it basically leaves only Keiji Muto as a main small city drawing card. New Japan dominated the balloting when it came to most popular wrestlers in the annual Gong magazine balloting. Keiji Muto topped Masahiro Chono in the balloting for most popular native wrestler, winning for the 4th straight year. On the foreign side, Scott Norton, who had finished second the past 2 years, bested Stan Hansen for first place. Hansen had won the balloting 10 years running. The remainder of the native side after Muto and Chono in order were Kenta Kobashi, Mitsuharu Misawa, Koji Kanemoto, Hiroyoshi Tenzan, Satoshi Kojima, Atsushi Onita, Hayabusa, Kensuke Sasaki, Kendo Kashin, Yoshinari Ogawa, Jushin Liger, Giant Baba, Shinya Hashimoto, Genichiro Tenryu, Super Delphin Shinjiro Otani, Jun Akiyama, and Toshiaki Kawada. On the foreign side behind Norton and Hansen was Vader, Dr. Wagner Jr., NWO Sting, Bill Goldberg, Johnny Ace, Sting, Steve Austin, Hulk Hogan, Big Titan, Johnny Smith, Kevin Nash, Sabu, Terry Funk, The Gladiator, Mike Awesome, Abdullah the Butcher, Bart Gunn, Marcus Bagwell, and Steve Williams. The women's top 20 most popular were Shinobu Kondori, Candy Akutsu, Takako Inoue, Manami Toyota, Mariko Yoshida, Kyoko Inoue, Asia Kong, Mio Wakizawa, Ayako Hamada, Chigusa Nagao, Lana Sasuka, Kari Suzuki, Keo Nomi, Meiko Satomura, Yumi Fukawa, Kaori Nakayama, Keo Nomi, Hikari Fukuoka, Yuko Kosugi, Michiko Omukai, and Mizuki Kana. Kenzo Suzuki, 24, a former rugby star at Meiji College, has started training at the New Japan Dojo for a debut this fall. Meiji College was the same school that has a connection to the promotion, since not only did Seiji Sakaguchi, Masa Saito and Ref Masao Hattori come from the college, but also Sakaguchi's college connections were the original network connections to maintain the television deal. The new tour opened on March 3 in Niigata before a sellout 3,700 with Chono and NWO Sting and Akira beating Titan and Tenzan, and Hiro Saito on top. Shiro Koshinaka and Kensuke Sasaki are getting a push this tour as a new tag team, including beating last year's tournament champs Muto and Kojima. New Japan cancelled Don Fry appearing on the 314 UFO show at Yokohama Arena. Fry was to face Gerard Gordeau, who will instead face Kazunari Murakami. Dory Funk was announced as coming to this show as a witness, kind of the role they've used ex-champions like Luthez, Billy Robinson, Danny Hodge, Lord Blears, etc. and over the years, for the Ogawa vs. Dan Severn NWA title match. February 27, TV did a 3.7 rating. Other Japan notes. Apparently the death of Satoshi Hasegawa of Pancrase on March 1 was accidental. He did not fall off the ledge of his own apartment as reported here last week. Apparently he was literally climbing walls playing Spider-Man near the Pancrase dojo, slipped off a third-floor ledge of an apartment building near the dojo and fell, suffering internal injuries that led to his death 9 hours later at the age of 22. Pancrase went on with its show on March 9 at Korakuen Hall that he was supposed to wrestle on, drawing an overflow 2,250 fans, which featured a 10-count memorial service for Hasegawa. In yet another example about trying to book real shoot groups, Yuki Kondo will face Semishult in the pay-per-view main event for the vacant King of Pancrase title that Guy Mizzer vacated on April 18, and on the Korakuen show Kondo lost via decision after 15 minutes to Kiyuma Kunyoku, which makes Kunyoku the number 1 ranked contender for the title. Main event on the show saw Ryushi Yanagisawa draw with Manabu Yamada. Former pro wrestler Yuhi Sano of the Takata Dojo team ended up as a late replacement for injured Shunsuke Matsui of the Takata team, and lost via ref stoppage in 10:43 against Keiichiro Yamamiya. In a match with a tremendous size difference, Takafumi Ito, who's about 170 pounds, lost to 6'10.5", 255-pound Shilton 145 via shoulder lock submission. 2 other matches for the April 18 pay-per-view show were announced by Pancrase: Kengo Watanabe vs. Bob Staines, the ISTA World Jiu-Jitsu Champion, and Asami Shibuya vs. Chris Little, the PWI Full Contact Karate Champion. Fight World Video Magazine reported that on the same show that Masakatsu Funaki would face Ebenezer Fontes Brica of Brazil in a Vale Tudo rules match. This match on the surface is kind of strange, because the Brazilian isn't a big name and has lost matches, including once to Dan Severn, but is a good fighter as he choked out Jeremy Horn last October on a UFC show. It's a deal where Funaki really doesn't help himself with the win, as he's a much bigger name in martial arts, but hurts himself badly if he doesn't win. The world-class wrestler with MMA experience far more powerful than Royce Gracie that was talked about but not announced as facing Nobuhiko Takada on April 29 in Nagoya at this point, barring anyone's change in plans as this has not been made public yet, is Mark Coleman, who was offered $60,000 for the shot at rehabbing Takada's mythical status that has sort of crumbled in the wake of reality. Takada's new promotion, Dream Stage Entertainment, which will promote shows with mainly shoot but occasional worked matches, has also announced that both Royce and Hickson Gracie would appear before the end of the year, and that on the Nagoya Rainbow Hall show, that Kazushi Sakuraba, Mark Kerr, Igor Vovchinchin and Gary Goodridge would appear. Michinoku Pro started its first tour since Super Delphin left the group this past week and has done pretty well. A big show on March 6 in Tokushima drew 1,937 fans for a match where Jinsei Shinzaki pinned Alexander Otsuka in 34-26 of what was reported as a good match. Shinzaki and Otsuka went to the same high school. Shinzaki is a few years later, in the Tokushima area, and Shinzaki basically pioneered the wrestling team at school that Otsuka learned wrestling on. Great Sasuke is back as a babyface, teaming with the likes of Gran Hamada and Shinzaki. Onita ran his own shows this week, including a 3/7 show at Korakuen Hall. In the main event, a no-rope barbed wire street fight tornado death match, Onita and Masato Tanaka beat Shoji Nakamaki and Yukihiro Kanemura. Genichiro Tenryu appeared at the show to shoot an angle. Onita tried to apologize to Tenryu for screwing him business-wise 4 years ago. The two hadn't talked in years before agreeing to work together for this angle, but Tenryu blew him off to build heat for the 3/14 show in Yokohama, which goes head-to-head with the Ogawa vs. Severn match in the same city. After they oppose each other in the tag match on March 14, they may get together and form a tag team in New Japan, since they have big names and it would allow Tenryu to carry the matches and get some value out of Onita's name even though he can't wrestle New Japan style. Dick Togo returned to Japan and aligned himself with Delphin on the final day of the recent CMLL Japan tour. Legendary sumo wrestler Akebono denied a lot of published rumors that he was thinking of getting into pro wrestling now that his sumo career has ended. Men's Teo is headed to Big Japan to feud with Abdullah the Butcher. War ran 3-1 at Korakuen Hall and drew poorly, about 1,000, with 2 title changes. Shinjiro Otani and Tatsuhiro Takaiwa dropped the international junior belts back to the war team of Tadahiro Ishii and Yuji Yasurioka. Basically nobody took that result seriously as anything other than what it was, since there is a huge discrepancy in talent and star power between the teams, and people saw it as the New Japan guys simply having to drop the belts to a team from the promotion that owns them. The other switch saw Masaaki Mochizuki win the international junior title from Masao Orihara, who is doing most of his wrestling these days as Sasuke the Great. Shinobu Kandori held a press conference this past week and said she was involved in an auto accident on February 26 in Tokyo and suffered injuries to her knees, ribs and fingers, and was told to stay out of action a few weeks by her doctor, but said she would still defend the WWA title on the 3/10 LLPW vs AJW show against Yumiko Hata, which will probably be where AJW gets its world title back. Not sure if the story is true or simply LLPW creating an angle to allow Kandori lose the world title while giving the impression she's going on with the match less than 100%. Here and there. Sports Illustrated in the 3/8 issue scorecard section had 2 items pertaining to pro wrestling. They ran a short story on the Alexander Karelin-Akira Maeda match, pretty much ripping on the idea of a wrestler with the credentials of Karelin joining the ranks of pro wrestlers, and were kind of scoffing at the Japanese media as well when noting that the match dominated the weekend sports coverage in Japan 2 weeks back. They made a snide remark that if Karelin goes to Sydney in 2000 he'll become the first pro wrestler to go for Olympic gold. Not actually true, as Svetlana Gundarenko and Chip Minton were in the 1992 and 1998 Olympics respectively after having done pro wrestling. And men. It was written that Karelin was making like Haystacks Calhoun, and how is that for a dated reference? By joining the ranks of pro wrestlers, and that with his win over Maeda, he'll surely be the first Olympian to have beaten a guy who once faced Andre the Giant. The other was a note on Shannon Hall, the women's boxer who was at one time a stripper and an American gladiator, who beat Becky Levy in the 1998 Women's Tough Man Contest Championship and turned pro boxer after that after failing in a tryout for Roller Jam. The story said that Hall may take up an offer to wrestle with the WWF, which she also mentioned in a recent appearance on Conan O'Brien. According to WWF officials, they are going to have a meeting with her shortly, but at this point nothing is signed. Apparently her father at one point wrestled independently. And speaking of Andre the Giant, the biography feature on Andre will be replayed on March 21st. I finally got a tape of it this week and will write more about it next week. I had gotten very mixed reviews of the show, with most people loving it and others feeling it was a farce. Based on what I've seen, it appeared to be a very well-produced fairy tale about the folk hero version of Andre the Giant. About 80% of the story, at least as it regarded the early part of his wrestling career, weren't accurate. It appeared that Edward Carpentier and Vince McMahon Jr. gave their versions of the Andre story which bore only a slight resemblance to accuracy. In particular, Andre himself always hated Carpentier, claiming to have discovered him. It was funny, because most of the stuff done by Frank Valois, finding him while touring France, taking him to meet Vince Sr., was said to have been done by Carpentier. There was no mention of Valois in the entire story. However, the funny thing to me is that with all the talk of Carpentier befriending him in France young and all that there were no photos of Carpentier with Andre before Montreal in the early 70s, but several photos of Valois with Andre from the 60s. What was very good about the piece were interviews with Andre's brother Jacques and several of his card-playing buddies and childhood friends from the tiny hamlet in the mountains that he grew up in. Another interesting myth that was debunked as the legend of Andre's grandfather. Andre had always claimed to have a grandfather who died young that he never met, who was 7'8" and 500 pounds. When they went back to the small town he grew up in and talked with his family members, none knew of such a grandfather. The future of Roller Jam is very much in question. Another change was made at the tapings this weekend to do 2 one-hour games with different teams instead of the current format of a 1-hour game, with the winner going on to the mega match against the leaders of the pack, the defending champions from the previous week. The final tapings for the season will be done on the weekend of 3/27 and 3/28. The idea of doing an arena tour this summer was cancelled, and the skaters were told they would use the off-season for training to make for better games next year. The product itself has shown noticeable improvements as the weeks have gone on, but it still has a ways to go, and still its only marketable point is building around the looks of a few of the prettier girls. This week's TV highlight was a feature showing Stacy Blitch posing for calendar shots in different bikinis. Apparently the season will end with heel Sean Atkinson of the California Quakes marrying top face woman Denise Lowden of the Florida Sundogs, the top face team, although even thought the games are taped in Orlando. The team that gets the most cheers are not the Sundogs' work as faces but the ultimate heels New York Enforcers, since they always come up on top at the end. The two are actually married in real life. Far more importantly is that the Nashville network, which is funding the show, is considering it something of a financial bloodbath. They were hoping for it to become the anchor for the network like Raw and Nitro are for their networks, and to draw a 2.0 rating in prime time on Friday. It's been doing 0.8 to 1.0 of late, and are seemingly on the verge of pulling out as there have been negotiations to put pro wrestling in the Friday night time slot. Mrs. Stasiak in Memphis is actually long time, and never has such a word been more apropos. Woman wrestler Johnny Mae Young, who I believe is now 75 and thus surpassed Lou Thez, who had his final match at the age of 74, and as Thez said about it, he was old enough by that time to know better. One of the superstars of women's wrestling of the early 50s glory days of the sport. Anyway, in the role of Sean Stasiak's bag lady mom, she attacked a security guard with her purse. Michael Hayes was at the show and beat up the syndicate with a garbage can. While Hayes' live interview in the Memphis studio a few weeks back when he debuted was corny and basically a sad parody of what he once was, his taped interviews from his Doak Hendricks set in the WWF sent in have been very good. The TV was to set up a match on March 6 in Jonesboro, Arkansas with Hayes and Baxter versus Baldo and Randy Hales. If Hayes and Baxter wins, then Baxter would own the company, Boy Tony would have to leave the territory for 1 year, Hales would get his head shaved and Baldo would lose the pay-per-view title. If Baldo and Hales win, that local Jonesboro DJ Ugly Ed Johnson would get his head shaved and Baxter would have to leave town for 1 year. Boy Tony would be the ref. Ricky Morton, fresh from the Inside Edition piece, no-showed the taping. Jerry Lawler and Bill Dundee agreed to team up in the upcoming tag team tournament. Mrs. Stasiak attacked Corey Macklin with her purse and challenged Stacy for a match on television. That match saw Mrs. Stasiak take 2 bumps, then fake a heart attack and told Corey Macklin to get her pills from her purse. When Macklin gave her the purse, she revived and hit Stacy with it. It wound up with Sean Stasiak and Lawler in the ring. Hayes worked on television beating Vic Grimes via DQ in the main event. In Puerto Rico, Sean Hill beat El Rockero on February 20th in Humacao to win the WWC Junior Heavyweight title. Pierre Roth Jr. turned babyface on that show as Ricky Santana and Shane Sewell, retained the WWC tag belts, beating Pierre Roth Jr. and Rico Suave when the heels collided and Suave was pinned. After the match, the two hit words and it wound up with Suave, Victor the Bodyguard and Chicky Star destroying Pierre Roth in a brutal 3-on-1 which included 8 shots with a metal drawer, 4 chair shots, being whipped with a belt, beaten with a broomstick and having a belt tied around his throat and being dragged around the floor of the arena and left laying on the floor covered in his own blood. Star and Victor then beat Santana and Shane on February 28th in Cabo Rojo to win the tag titles. Also on that show, Carlos Colon beat Victor to win the Puerto Rican Championship, making this his 8th title reign. Pierre Roth Jr. then beat Shane on February 21st in Lajas to regain the Intercontinental title and is now defending against the heels like Suave and Star. Saw a tape of Kick-Ass Wrestling, which is the competition show. It's like the worst show ever. They taped it every Wednesday night at the Mardi Gras nightclub in Memphis using Gold Club girls. They used Midget D who did Bill Dundee imitations. Music City Wrestling has moved the regular weekly wrestling night in Nashville from Saturday to Friday starting on March 5th, which drew about 220 fans to the fairgrounds. This coming week they are running 2 shows as on March 12th they'll headline with Jerry Lawler and Spellbinder Streak in Memphis versus Reno Riggins and Stephen Dunn, with the winners of that match facing the return of the Fabulous Ones, Steve Kieran and Stan Lane, the next night. Barry Houston is coming in on March 12th. The original plan was for Brian Christopher and Spellbinder to defend their tag titles against the Tennessee Vols on March 12th, but that match has been moved to 325, with a storyline reason given that Christopher refused to return if there is a Nashville-based referee. Farron Fox is doing the Andy Kaufman gimmick where he wrestles women out of the crowd and offers $500 if any of them can make him pin or submit in 5 minutes. USWF on March 20th in Amarillo, Texas for the final show at the Fairgrounds Coliseum before it gets torn down is headlined by Evan Tanner defending the heavyweight title against Mike Chisek and Eric Payne defending the lightweight title against Mark Cantu, plus a light heavyweight tournament. Japan's Weekly Pro Wrestling had more old memos from the Sam Mushnick collection in its multi-part history of the NWA feature. It was clear that after averting the split-up in 1961, apparently over the Sonny Myers lawsuit, that the NWA nearly fell apart again around 1963 to 1964 during the last Lou Thez reign. There was a bulletin on February 1, 1963 written by Mushnick, informing everyone of Thez winning the title from Buddy Rogers and basically the preemptory strike as everyone knew what was coming next, formation of the WWF with Rogers as champion. Mushnick wrote, "It is the duty of all members to recognize the Alliance champion in their advertising, promotion and publicity. There are some, who in all probability, will want to advertise someone else as champion, now that they have reaped the fruits of NWA advertising. If so, that is their prerogative, but if they do, they should tender their resignation to the NWA. That would be the decent thing to do." By the summer of 1964, Mushnick himself was contemplating disbanding the NWA. In a letter to Leroy McGurk of Tulsa on June 15, 1964, he talked about the NWA as being a once strong organization but that interest of late had diminished greatly. Mushnick was very disappointed that the NWA members voted unanimously to help raise money for the U.S. Olympic team for the 1964 Olympics, and after the vote, very few members did anything. Mushnick wrote, "Believe me, interest has diminished so much that sometimes I wonder why I'm taking it so seriously. There are other instances of lackadaisical attitudes. It gets very discouraging and sometimes I feel like dropping out of the picture, yet I know if I do that the alliance will disintegrate because no one else takes the interest I have taken. The NWA has been a good thing for wrestling, but whether it can continue under present conditions, I don't know. I don't want to be the one to start the ball rolling for dissolution, but, unfortunately, from what has transpired during the past few years, I think it is the thing to do. Maybe after a couple of years the fellows will realize just how much the NWA was helpful to our game and a reorganization could be made." More updates on the title history of Masa Saito thanks to Mike Abbey. Saito left San Francisco in 1974 and wrestled out of Vancouver, British Columbia for 1 year, and may have worked Oregon during that time as well. On November 11, 1974, he and Gene Kiniski won the Canadian Open Tag Team titles, beating Dan Crawford, not the former tag team partner of Doug Furness but the big-name Calgary wrestler of that time period, and Wayne Bridges, a former big star in England. They dropped the belts on March 3, 1975 to Guy Mitchell, who in the 80s wrestled as Jerry Valiant, and Armand Malumba have no idea who he was. On August 10, 1975, he teamed with old rival Dale Lewis to win the belts from Mitchell and Ricky Hunter, and eventually dropped them on September 8, 1975 to Dennis Stamp and Tiger Jeet Singh, after which he returned to San Francisco and formed a regular tag team, first with the Great Fuji, Mr. Fuji, and later Don Morocco. There remains a lot of internal bickering in the current, and not to be confused with the former version of the NWA, see Reader's Pages. On the tag team title front, and some of this is explained on the Reader's Pages, the Brotherhood, Eric Spraxia, and Knuckles Nelson, managed by Tony Rumble, were scheduled to drop the title on February 28 in North Richland Hills, Texas to Team Extreme. Due to weather problems, the Brotherhood didn't arrive in Texas for the show. Since Team Extreme had already done angles and cut promos under the idea they'd have the belts for the next week, a compromise was reached for the titles to be held up. Rumble didn't like the idea his team was stripped. They attempted to put the match together again for 3/19, but due to Spraxia getting his knee scoped, that wasn't possible either, and now it looks like the match wouldn't be able to take place until April. The England promotion Hammerlock Wrestling has joined the NWA, and there is work being done for 2 women's pay-per-view shows called WNWA, run by Tor Berg, who ran one LLPW pay-per-view show many years ago, with others involved including Roller Jam announcer Ken Resnick, Nick Bockwinkel, Joe Pedicino, and Brad Reingens. They also created an NWA Junior Heavyweight Championship. Didn't they already have one that they sold to the Japanese? On March 3 in Parkersburg, West Virginia, with Logan Kane, who I believe is actually the half-brother of Al Snow, or at least that's what he says, beating Viper to win it. Billy Graham's latest hip surgery went well on February 26, and he was expected to be released from the hospital on March 9 to start a lengthy recovery process. Global Pro Wrestling on March 20 in Fort Smith, Arkansas. There was some major media controversy this past week in Ventura Country regarding a backyard wrestling group. There was a huge article in the 3/2 Oaks Star, talking about teenagers in the Real Wrestling Federation doing matches with barbed wire, boards and light tubes held in public parks and backyards, including a spot where someone jumped off the roof of a house onto another guy laying on a table. The Ventura Police Department have shut down some shows. After the newspaper report and follow-up report by local television stations, Andre Verdun, a 17-year-old high school student who organized the show, said he had shut it down until everything blows over. The principal of the local high school, Jamie Castellanos of Buena High, of which students did the shows, sent an email to the paper saying doing the story about the shows in the first place was irresponsible and reprehensible because what you have done now is given this group of misguided students notoriety and free advertisement. It makes my job and that of my colleagues more difficult as we take stands against violence and attempt to teach students responsibility. But Verdun, who wasn't considered a popular kid in school, was signing autographs for fellow students after the TV and newspaper publicity before his mother pulled him out of school to avoid the television news cameras that were coming. It had the expected quotes after from Verdun, whose goal in life is to wrestle for ECW, saying that it's risky but all pro wrestling is risky, and from parents and students outraged by all of this. Anyway, the funniest part was Verdun trying to use his newfound notoriety to run for ASB president of his school, although he did not know what the letters ASB stood for. UWA in England looks to be bringing in Christopher Daniels from California. Mid-American Wrestling out of West Allis, Wisconsin looks to be certain it's going to run a hardcore-style promotion as the show on March 6 with Ian Rotten and Madman Pondo drew 486 in a 320-seat building. Pro Wrestling International is running 320 at the Windy City Fieldhouse in Chicago. The E! Channel shot a piece of the 3/6 Incredibly Strange Wrestling show in Hollywood, California. Midwest Renegade Wrestling will be holding its one-year anniversary show on March 19 at Overland Community College in St. Louis with Abdullah the Butcher vs. Madman Pondo as the main event. MMA. Kazuyoshi Ishii of K1 announced that they were negotiating for a regular weekly television outlet on Canal Plus in France to lead to running shows there, and talked about wanting to run shows in both Las Vegas and Madison Square Garden in 1999, but it appears neither will take place until August at the earliest. K1 did a sellout house show in Las Vegas last year, but the show did poorly on pay-per-view and subsequent pay-per-view shows have been postponed. The latest controversy within UFC has been regarding the allowing to tape the knuckles. It's basically weighing the risk versus rewards. The problem is that once gloves were brought into play, it changed the game to where punches became a more important weapon. In the old UFC, going bare knuckle, you could only throw a few punches before doing damage to your hands, which is one of the reasons. The other being less experienced fighters overall, why submission experts dominated. Now the key element seems to be either wrestlers who can punch or boxers or Muay Thai style boxers with the ability to avoid a takedown or neutralize their foe's offense when being taken down. But even with the gloves, fighters are still breaking their hand as the most common injury in the show, and some of the best young fighters such as Tito Ortiz and Mikey Burnett have done some major hand damage in their recent wins. A petition was circulated at the show, which just about every fighter signed, to allow taping of the hands. It ups the danger factor as far as damage from punches, because nobody will ever get brain damage from breaking their hand, which is the aspect UFC is trying to play down. But the punches make for a more exciting show for the audience, which still is the prime objective for survival. UFC's business dealings with Brazil have fallen apart, which may result in cancellation of more of the proposed dates for this year, as 2 of the remaining shows were planned for Brazil, and being underwritten by Brazil. The reason given was the decline in the value of Brazilian currency, and the original deal was with a different currency value. ECW. With the next influx of cash, the payroll checks have been clearing, so morale is a little better, but the feeling among the wrestlers is that nobody is betting on the future. Even Tommy Dreamer once again went on a radio show this week saying that if he got a serious offer from either company that he'd take it, and said he had a handshake agreement with Paul Heyman and not a contract. For a variety of reasons, including in some cases checks to the stations bouncing, ECW lost television this week in Boston, Chicago, Atlanta, Buffalo, and Pittsburgh, which are some of its most important markets. The Boston deal doesn't appear to be major, as they are looking at getting back on the same station in a new time slot. In Chicago, ECW was paying $3,000 per week for a market they have yet to run, and a station that isn't even carried throughout the market, so they let the deal go and are looking for a new station. Atlanta was given up due to financial problems, and they are looking at negotiating for a new outlet in that market. Buffalo was pulled out of as they were paying $850 per week, but didn't have a steady time slot as the station aired it at a different time each week. Pittsburgh was also lost due to bounced checks to the station. They have picked up WMIA in Miami starting on March 27. Several undercard wrestlers who were promised contracts but never actually given them, have been actually given the contracts to look over this past week. The pay-per-view show on March 21 from Asbury Park, New Jersey, which looks like it'll be a sellout, has Taz vs. Sabu for the ECW title, Rob Van Dam vs. Jerry Lynn for the TV title, Yoshihiro Tajiri vs Super Crazy, New Jack vs Mr. Mustafa, Dreamer and Shane Douglas vs Just Incredible and Lance Storm as the top matches, plus Sid and the Dudleys will appear. Despite rumors to the contrary, there are no plans to use Chris Condito and Tammy Sytch anytime soon, and they are definitely not on the pay-per-view show. Condito and Sytch have told Heyman they are undergoing psychiatric counseling and are involved in an outpatient drug rehab program. Tammy's mother had them in court this past weekend and got the restraining order against her extended through May. The house shows this past week were 3/4 in Northeast Philadelphia, which drew 500 fans, and 3/5 in Dover, Delaware, before about 1,000. Nothing major new at either show, the latter of which was a taping and said to be the weakest TV taping in a long time with poor crowd reactions. Chris Benoit and Dean Malenko were backstage at the show. The new ECW magazine should be hitting the newsstands in a few weeks. Spike Dudley is expected to wear a Rey Mysterio Jr. mask at the ECW arena this weekend, since Mysterio Jr. is basically doing the giant killer gimmick that Spike used. The TV this week was totally uneventful. Much of the show was knocks at WCW, and in particular the uncensored pay-per-view. Because it was done several times and not once, it made announcer Joey Styles come off as a whiny crybaby as he tried to claim that the term uncensored was copying ECW's gimmick, that the three-way with Raven, Sandman and Bam Bam Bigelow was using ECW wrestlers in an ECW-style match, and that Hogan vs. Flair wouldn't be any good in barbed wire because they are two 50-year-old millionaires who wouldn't be taking any chances, and besides, the barbed wire is fake and at ECW they use real barbed wire. It then aired the famous Sabu vs. Terry Funk barbed wire match, of course, Funk being older than either Flair or Hogan, but for some reason that doesn't count, even though Flair is a better worker and a better talker and has retained his star status on a national basis better than Funk, and said Hogan and Flair couldn't compare with that match. And for brutality, they can't, although I'd be shocked if they didn't put on a better wrestling match, as this was 6 stunt man spots and nothing else, although it was quite a spectacle. He tried to say how their pay-per-view on March 21st will be better than uncensored. So many times Heyman has had Styles has tried to sell ECW shows as being better than WWF or WCW, and so many times they've fallen flat, although with Crazy vs. Tajiri and Van Dam vs. Lynn, combined with what I'd figure uncensored will turn into, this time it seems like a safe path to walk. WCW. The latest on the 3/14 uncensored show that has been announced is Hogan vs. Flair for the title in the First Blood cage match, Rey Mysterio Jr. vs. Kevin Nash, Barry Windham and Curt Hennig vs. Chris Benoit and Dean Malenko for the tag titles in a lumberjack strap match, Hawk vs. Raven vs. Bigelow in a three-way, Jerry Flynn vs. Ernest Miller and Sonny Wanu in a handicap match, and Chris Jericho vs. Perry Saturn in a dog collar match. At this point on television they haven't announced Stevie Ray vs. Vince in a street fight, but that is still planned. Booker T vs. Scott Hall for the US title is off. Mark Coleman was offered $50,000 to do a match on the show and put over Goldberg, but it doesn't appear that's going to happen. Several people advised Coleman against doing it, and at the same time Nash nixed it, apparently saying something to the effect in the booking meeting that what if Vince pays him $100,000 to double-cross Goldberg on live pay-per-view and embarrassing the company? Of course the answer to that one is to tape the match on location, so if a spot doesn't look good it can be redone and there would be zero threat of a double-cross, as if it was ever going to happen in the first place. At one point last week the plan was for Goldberg vs. Scott Steiner and Rick Steiner vs. Bagwell, with stipulations to be added, but neither match was announced on television yet. Nitro on March 8 in Worcester, Massachusetts drew 10,856, 1,800 short of a sellout. And when was the last time Nitro failed to sell out a building of that size? Which was 9,708, paying $285,733. While the first hour was going on, the fans live got to see 4 dark matches. See results. The first hour saw a bunch of replays of Hogan and Flair interviews, with Flair starting his heel turn and Hogan starting his face turn. Then they played a video on AC Jazz of the Nitro Girls. They went to Brown University for several Nitro party segments. Hogan and Nash made fun of Flair from his interview from last week. Steiner and Buff did a funny segment where they were arresting people around Boston for letting the time expire on their parking meter, etc. That was actually funny, since they were waiting for a guy whose parking meter expired. He claimed he had no change, so they picked him upside down and shook him, and a bunch of change came out of his pockets. They did a segment where Hogan and Nash met Tori Wilson as a shooting range where she was trying to be either La Femme Nikita or Brigitte Nielsen in Beverly Hills Cop 2. This led to another horrible sketch where Wilson was going to bring out this woman so hot that David Flair could never resist. Way hotter than her, and her name was Mrs. Robinson, reference to the 60s movie The Graduate, and they offered her $20,000 to seduce David. Never mind that we've already established that Rick doesn't care. Anyway, the show opened with David Flair with Tori Wilson. Some background on Wilson: besides winning the Miss Galaxy contest, which is a combination bikini and fitness contest, she recently moved from Idaho, where she's originally from, to Los Angeles to seek her fame and fortune as an actress in September. She's been taking acting classes and was steered in the direction of Peter Young, who has also worked with Hogan. Let's see, we've already established that she's only with David because Hogan and Nash told her to be. Luckily for the storyline, one thing you need to know: this is a shoot, and in the Flair household on Mondays they watch Raw and only switch to Nitro when Rick is on, so it actually makes perfect sense David would have no idea about things that happen in front of a few million people. Wait a minute, this was in the first hour. So David would have been watching. Goldberg came out and David got in his face, so Goldberg snatched him. Rick then showed up, saw on the monitor that Goldberg snatched David and went after Goldberg, throwing the big chop and no-sell spot. Let's see. Rick doesn't care about David, so he goes after Goldberg for snatching David? If I had any say-so in Time Warner, I'd put a lot of money into marketing a headache reliever and advertise it as the Nitro painkiller every Monday night throughout the show. They wound up building up a match. If anyone had any question as to the motives of the people who write the TV, answer this question. Why, when you have the first ever Flair vs. Goldberg match, the two biggest ratings draws in the company, is the challenge and angle done in the first segment of the second hour, after 25% of the audience has already switched the station, rather than doing the angle in the first hour to the larger audience and hoping to keep them from switching out in the first place? Raven vs. Hawk went 3:15 of doing stuntman spots until Bigelow showed up. Fans booed the interference. They brawled backstage for another 9 minutes, which saw a lot of hard work, but it was way too long and became repetitive. You could hear the fans live getting sick of it after a few minutes. All three were told to stay away from the limo, really, so of course they wound up on the limo and Hack's head went through the windshield. Bigelow put Raven through a table. Then suddenly, with no rhyme nor reason, remember that phrase every Monday, they went to a replay of a brawl from last week. The three-way never had an ending, and none of it was ever acknowledged again the rest of the show. Jericho beat Lizmark Jr. in a dog collar match with the Lion Tamer in 4:28. This wasn't good. Steiner and Bagwell made Bischoff look like a fool from halfway around the world with his comments last week about toning down the sexual references in interviews. Steiner beat Booker T in a decent match in 14:03 when Bagwell interfered. T also didn't give up to the recliner and again did the DDP pass out. There was a huge steroid chant during the match which lasted for several minutes. Don't they know that WCW extensively drug tests all its athletes constantly, and nobody in the company could possibly ever be accused of such a thing? Not content to beat Mr. T, they beat High Up after with a chair shot. Jerry Flynn did an interview backstage, I guess to make sure the fans live didn't boo the segment out of the building. Sonny Onoo came out and Flynn snatched him, and Ernest Miller kicked Flynn and Onoo cut off his ponytail. Mysterio Jr. beat Scott Norton in 7:20 after a kick low. Mysterio Jr. did a good job of selling, but this match was negative stars. Norton sold nothing the entire match and made it clear he considered it a joke. The fans were yelling that Mysterio Jr. sucks, so whatever this was designed to do worked in reverse, unlike most of what appears on Nitro, which buries people by design. I guess if anyone didn't recognize what a great worker Bigelow is last week, they do now. Bret Hart beat Van Hammer in 10:45 with the sharpshooter. Hart hit Hammer with a chair 3 times after the match. Nobody cared, although Hart got a huge babyface pop coming out, and then the crowd died once the match started. Flair vs. Goldberg was the same Flair vs. Nikita Koloff match from 10 years ago, which is all the Flair spots and selling, no selling by his foe, and carrying a limited guy to a good match, although Goldberg has 10 times the charisma and 5 times the ability of Nikita in those days. Match had great heat live, but it didn't play as well on television because Hogan and Nash were burying the intensity with their commentary. After Goldberg hit the spear, the NWO Black and White ran in for the no contest. Flair and Goldberg were pounding on the Job Squad, although Stevie Ray wasn't willingly selling for Flair, until Hogan and Nash came in with Steiner and Buff and overpowered the guys until the show went off the air. Steve McMichael has been at most of the tapings but was kept off to sell the eye injury that was never acknowledged. However, his eye has been fine working the house shows. There was a lot of heat between Hart and Bischoff over an autograph session scheduled for Campbell, California, as if that city sounds familiar, although that it was practically down the street from me is simply a coincidence, on February 20th. Basically, most of the top WCW guys do autograph sessions and get paid very good for it. One top guy who does them every weekend grosses up to $40,000 per month on them, but technically they aren't supposed to. For whatever reason, the company decided to flex its muscles and ordered Hart, Benoit, Kidman and Jericho not to appear and threatened the store with a lawsuit. The other three sort of chalked it up to another bad experience, but Hart was more upset because of the knowledge that everybody does it, and he felt his contract allowed him to do it, but Diane Myers of WCW Legal felt it didn't. Speaking of Hart's contract, since that has become pretty relevant, his 3-year deal was actually a 2-year deal with option years. WCW can actually cut him in 9 months, but if WCW wants to keep him, he can't go to WWF, and WCW has gotten so bad that isn't as far-fetched as it sounded even 2 months ago, for a long time. Nash is feeling that paying Hart $2.5 million for the year 2000 would be dumb business, and he's clearly doing his best to make sure it is even dumber. As for the Jimmy Hart rumors about leaving, he also has quite a bit of time left on his contract. If he was given a release, he very well could leave, but that could also be said for 70% of the guys in the company, so at this point it's not even a news story. Thunder in Winston-Salem on March 4 drew 4,198 fans in a 15,177-seat building, making it the first totally disastrous turnout for a major TV taping in a long time, with a $114,310 gross. The live show drew a 3.65 rating and a 5.7 share. They opened taping matches for the 311 show with Raven pinning David Taylor with a DDT, Benoit and McMichael over disorderly conduct, and Flynn pinning Johnny Swinger. The live show opened with Flair acting like he didn't care about his son and Anderson not being able to understand. Flair's portrayal is a man who lives for the pop so much and forgetting the title that he doesn't care about anything else. It wasn't until 8:26 p.m. that they went to the building, and that was for Rick Steiner over Hugh Morris in 3:32 with a bulldog off the top. Then, in a hilarious spot that aired twice on the show, they aired a promo piece for Nitro that had never aired before, and it had 2 clips of Sean Waltman, who hasn't even been with the company in 1 year. Malenko and Benoit did an interview to build up their lumberjack strap match. They fell right into the trap, as they were finally given an interview, and it had nothing to say. Gene Okerlund saved this segment as they weren't even explaining the steps to their match in a way that anyone could understand. Miller and Wanu won a handicap match from Al Green in 3:35 when Wanu pinned Green after a spin kick after Miller had kicked him first. Saturn and Jericho traded barbs, with Jericho calling Saturn Tootsie. Bigelow pinned Iaukea in 5:38. Boring. Horace and Vince vs. Wyndham and Hennig went 1:48 before Ray attacked Vince, and then Benoit and Malenko attacked Wyndham and Hennig. Benoit and Malenko weren't even over big as horsemen in Winston-Salem, which shows you can only play babyface and let the fans down so many times before it's over. Jim Duggan did an interview about battling cancer, which was a shoot and the best thing on the show. He got a great response by the end because people understood it was real. I wish he'd have mentioned Brian Hildebrand. Kidman beat Chavo Guerrero Jr. with a shooting star press in 9:47 in a really good match. Hogan did the interview trying to get over that everything he did was just for business and he knows people hate him, but it was really Flair who was holding down all the young guys to feed his ego. Show ended with Bagwell over Booker T with the buff blockbuster after Scott gave him 2 chair shots in 9:12 after T accidentally kicked Mickey J. A boring main event. And they taped more matches for next week, with Hawk over Barbarian in what was said to have been atrocious, Mysterio Jr. and Booker T over Bagwell and Steiner when Mysterio Jr. pinned Bagwell after T had set him up, and the final bout saw Flair bet Disco with the figure 4. There were steroid chants big time in the Bagwell-Steiner match, and Scott lost it and went into the crowd after fans legit. I guess he was appointed by the Winston-Salem police for a one-day job as well and thought the chants were alerting him to the fact an illegal drug deal was going on somewhere in the building. For February 19th in the UK, Raw drew 350,000 viewers to Nitro's 260,000 and 130,000 for Thunder. Hugh Morris just signed a new 3-year deal. There is talk of putting Mike Enos and Scotty Riggs together as an undercard tag team with a gimmick. They will be debuting a new logo at the April 5th Nitro from Las Vegas. Canyon is working as a consultant for the NBC TV movie currently being filmed based on the life of Jesse Ventura, although the movie itself is not meant as an accurate bio. The odds are increasing that Jericho is leaving. Goldberg will be on the cover of Paw magazine in April, which did a major photo shoot with several WCW wrestlers on March 9th. House shows this week saw Saturday night taping on March 2nd in Rock Hill, South Carolina drew 3,337, paying $60,673. 3/3 in Cullowhee, North Carolina drew 3,542, paying $72,250. 3/5 in Florence, South Carolina drew 5,657, paying $110,140. 3/6 in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania drew 4,511 paying $78,010 and 3/7 in Rochester, New York drew 6,266 paying $154,555. Merchandise for 3/1 through 3/7 was $248,838 or $5.53 per head. The Carolina shows were headlined by Flair over Wyndham while the Northeast shows were headlined by Sting over Bigelow. None of the events over the past week sold out. Sunday newspaper supplement magazine React aimed at teens did a pro wrestling story concentrating on Goldberg, calling him pro wrestling's biggest star with a cover drawing which was the basic puff piece. Remember this quote? Goldberg, when asked about the WWF, said he considered it shock TV and would retire tomorrow rather than be a part of it. WCW Saturday Night on March 6 did a 2.4 rating. WWF. An update on WrestleMania's lineup. It is definite that Mankind vs. Paul White will be a match where the winner will go on to referee the Austin Rock title match. With Luna fired, the Sable vs. Luna match will be changed, most likely to Sable vs. Tori. The Hardcore title will be a three-way with Road Dogg, Bob Holly, and Al Snow. Bart Gunn vs. Butterbean will do a brawl for all. The plan for a tag team battle royal at WrestleMania, which was going to include Jarrett and Hart, it was never on the books to do the rumored six-person with Deborah and Ivory, although it was discussed and probably eventually will happen because Mark Henry probably won't be ready until about a week after Mania after having both knees scoped, is off. It appears they will do a battle royal on the live Heat show with the final two in the battle royal getting a tag title shot on the pay-per-view. Mankind's knees are getting progressively worse due to a screw from a previous operation coming loose. The plan is he's going to keep going for the next 3 weeks and probably have surgery, and if not, be given some time off at that point. Billy Gunn was out of action the past 2 weekends, although he did work television, because he had a respiratory infection and fluid in his lungs, and the plan is for him to return at the house shows this coming weekend. Road Dogg took his place in Chicago and Milwaukee. South Bend, Indiana seems to be the world's most unlucky site for WWF. A few months back they had a show set and it was cancelled due to a blizzard. The makeup date was 3/5 for an afternoon date, with the idea of the wrestlers flying into Chicago, driving to South Bend, and driving back to Chicago for the night show. However, O'Hare Airport was shut down due to the weather during the morning and not enough wrestlers were going to be able to get to South Bend, so the show was postponed once again, this time with a date added on April 22nd. The airport opened up in the afternoon and basically the entire crew except for 1 or 2 guys made it into Chicago, and they ran basically the show as planned at the Horizon, drawing the 7th consecutive house show sellout in that market. Ken Shamrock was given the weekend off as he was appearing for Max Muscle magazine in a booth at the Arnold Classic in Columbus, Ohio. Reports that Steven Regal will return doing his old WCW gimmick at this point appear premature. Regal is still in rehab and is not figured into any plans because there is no time frame when he'll be able to return, although they are shooting for late April or early May. As far as rumors flying everywhere and discussed last week of Raw expanding to 3 hours if the ratings stay strong, late week WWF reports claim there is nothing to it and that nothing has even been discussed regarding it. It is said that a suggestion was brought up months ago when the race was closer on Monday, since WCW did have an advantage in a close race with a lead-in. USA at the time felt it had such a financial investment in the Walker, Texas Ranger showed that it didn't want to mess with its Monday through Friday 8 p.m. slot. Giant Silva was sent to Mexico to train under Negro Casas and wrestle in EMLL. He was at the office on March 5th but didn't appear at the Arena Mexico show that evening. Because he is so huge and most Mexican wrestlers are so small, he probably will be a huge gate attraction his first time in every city. Kurgan may also be sent to Mexico to work with or against him. Kurgan was something of a draw in Mexico probably 6 or so years back under the name Goliath El Gigante, feuding with Kanek in the old UWA. Kurt Angle is headed to Memphis and should start in a few weeks. Luna was let go this past week because of 4 separate incidents where there were problems with other talent and things said that made the front office decide it was impossible to keep her. Apparently the things she said a few weeks ago on Raw about not getting a shot because she's not as pretty as Sable had been bothering her. She had problems in recent weeks backstage with Sable, Mark Marrow, Jack Lanza, and Jacqueline. She complained about the angle where Gangrel was hung by the Ministry as a prelude to them joining. She basically challenged Mark Marrow to a fight backstage before the Memphis pay-per-view. She blew up at Jacqueline, who she had been friends with, in Dayton, claiming that the Jacqueline vs. Ivory match on Heat that didn't air was them stealing her style of match, whatever that means, and got mad at Lanza that night as well. This led to several of the women being uncomfortable working with her. The plan at one point was for her to win the title from Sable at Mania, although with Sable getting over so huge due to Playboy and the turn, that may have been changed. There is talk about doing a 1-hour weekly show patterned after the old Glow show for women characters. They are doing a casting call next week in Los Angeles to bring more pretty women into the company. Although Dan Severn is considered done, he has not gotten a contract release. There may be an issue of him making the deal with Inoki before getting his WWF release, particularly since it is such a big money deal. Severn had a unique contract with the WWF in that it enabled him to take outside bookings and shoot fights. WWF has been contacted by CBS TV about doing a movie of the week starring Austin in the role he played on Nash Bridges, which would probably double as a potential TV pilot for a series. The episode of Nash Bridges was not the highest rating in the show's history, but it finished number 23 in the primetime ratings, and the show has never finished higher than number 33 in its history, and it's been around for years. Austin opened up a lot of bigwigs' eyes, particularly at CBS and Time Warner, because he had major network ratings drawing power, something that it isn't believed either Hogan or Piper have. People are already talking of the hiring of Public Enemy as being a mistake. Johnny Grunge, in particular, just looks totally out of his league in the WWF. If you watch the Heat match against the Acolytes, both guys, Bradshaw in particular, was stiffing them left and right on spots. Some of the stuff Bradshaw was throwing was really brutal. Apparently this was meant as a message and was condoned by those in charge. There are no signs of any kind of advertiser backlash, nor will there be at any time soon. With ratings setting records, ad spots are going at record rates. There are going to be some changes in the television content. The sexual content is going to be kept, although skits like the deal in mid-January where Chyna had her butt and breasts grabbed and Mark Henry got the simulated blowjob from a guy probably won't be repeated. The language will be toned down, using butt instead of ass and bleeping more words out. Road Dogg was yelled at after Cleveland for calling Bob Holly and Al Snow pussies. Suck It will be kept since that's such an integral part of the show, with the idea that isn't bad language but simply a marketing slogan. The WWF CD dropped to number 16 on the charts this past week, selling another 71,216 units. The Slammin' Wrestling album was number 131 at 10,117 units. The 1993 WrestleMania album already has pre-orders of 100,000 units, which is very strong for a re-release of a 6-year-old album. Sable has been all over the place with the Playboy coming out this week, including Stern. Told the story that accompanies the photos was a mixture of fact, married to Mark Marrow, and fiction, how she got her job. They didn't give her age, which is listed at 31 but is probably closer to 36 or 37. They had the top makeup person shoot her, and everyone is very complimentary to how the photos turned out, and given the popularity of wrestling, no doubt this issue is going to sell like crazy. She will be taping for a sizable role in La Femme Nikita the first week of April in Toronto. In the Undertaker-Mankind match on Raw on March 1st, where Mankind needed to win to be the ref, apparently Michael Cole didn't even acknowledge the finish on the live commentary or even who won, despite it being a stip match, and when the replay aired on Heat on March 7th, there was a totally new track with Cole making a big deal of Mankind winning to become special ref. The Jim Ross segments have done great quarter hours. Apparently the original idea was for Ross to be turned heel as a way of people accepting Cole as the regular announcer and not seeing him as simply the guy there until Ross gets better. In addition, Ross would be used as a mouthpiece to try and get Steve Williams over. The company expected Ross to turn himself heel in Cleveland by slapping Bart Gunn, but the reaction was exactly the opposite. So they've dropped plans of making him a heel. The first segment was really pathetic as far as the idea behind it because of how they were trying to exploit his illness, but I must say his performance in Pittsburgh was incredible. It was not his idea, and the plan still is for him to be aligned with Williams and serve as his mouthpiece, and there are no plans imminent for him to return to announcing. WWF was pushing Undertaker appearing on a special episode of Poltergeist on USA Network next week, which also coincidentally goes head-to-head with the WCW pay-per-view show. Howard Finkel is now doing a backstage stooge gimmick taken after the role Hogan and Nash have been playing with the black and white on Nitro. There was a funny spot where Finkel went to Rock and told him that Paul White was hot, and Rock came back saying he knew Finkel was something of a fruit. Rock appears on the net on March 13th. The Kurt Angle Tiger Ali Singh Angle commentary by Terry Taylor, who was better on his second week of Heat but still doesn't come off as smooth and was way below the level of Jim Cornette, was funny to me because Taylor got over Angle using almost the same wording that Bill Watts used to get over Taylor in his first big angle with Mid-South Wrestling in 1984 when he faced Nikolai Volkov. That angle worked. Huge at the time. There were some problems regarding the New York State Athletic Commission and indie NWA promoters Rick O'Brien and Dennis Corraluzzo. Corraluzzo booked some WWF talent on a show for O'Brien in Staten Island. O'Brien then advertised his show in posters as a WWF and NWA show. The New York State Athletic Commission contacted the WWF about the advertising and they freaked. When the mess was sorted out, the commission claimed that Corraluzzo didn't have a matchmaker's license in New York, so he legally couldn't take money for booking talent. The end result is that the WWF is no longer going to deal with Corraluzzo when it comes to booking talent. But that also means nothing, as they still send talent to his shows and simply book them through Corraluzzo's right-hand man Joe Panzarino, Dapper Johnny Falco, instead of Corraluzzo himself. House shows for the week saw the Raw taping on March 2nd in Pittsburgh draw a sellout 13,497, paying $296,555. 3/5 in Chicago drew a sellout 18,096, paying $377,185, and 3/6 in Milwaukee drew a sellout 15,950, paying $304,584. Merchandise for the week was $338,721 or $7.12 per head. Main stuff was Austin and Mankind over Rock and Kane in the same rattlesnake match, Hart and Jarrett winning 3 ways over Triple H and X-Pac, and Gangrel and Christian and Venus over Road Dogg. Godfather now gives the host of Finkel at the house shows. Tapings on March 28 and 3/29 at Nassau and Meadowlands. Bakersfield Heat on March 14, Rochester House Show on March 21, the entire UK tour from April 2 through April 4, and even Madison Square Garden on April 24, with no matches announced, are already sold out. Jim Ross will probably be meeting with Mark Kerr and Mark Coleman next week. They seem more interested in Kerr since he's got a good look and is very articulate, although people that have seen and trained with both say Coleman is far more advanced when it comes to doing pro wrestling. Bob Raceman in the New York Daily News did a column on Sable on March 5. Sable, when it comes to the WWF's direction, said, "As a responsible parent, I choose not to let my child watch it, raw. My child is very young. She has a bad time and she's in bed when our show comes on. To me, that's being a responsible parent. Ultimately, it's the parent's decision. If you do not wish your child to watch the WWF, change the channel. It's not our place to put on a show that's supposedly for your children. It's your place as a parent to monitor what your children watch." She said the criticism of the product is hypocritical because the lack of parental responsibility is ignored in the criticism of the product, and that other forms of kids' entertainment aren't scrutinized as closely. Actually, that's not true. Are they saying it's not okay to see the characters we play beat up each other, but it's okay to have your child watch a movie where a famous actor blows away 100 people with an M16? She claimed that the character she plays is not degrading to women, saying, "I feel I'm being a strong, stand-up woman. People don't have to like what I do or agree with what I do because they don't have to live my life. I would much rather my daughter, when she grows up, do what she wants to do because she wants to do it, not because of what someone else thinks." When Raceman brought up that Sable is playing a heel but that nobody is booing her, she pointed to her chest and said, "Why would they boo this?" The report last week about Sable charging $85 for autographed copies of Playboy isn't exactly correct or incorrect. Sable signed a bunch of issues and they are being sold at an autograph show that she isn't appearing at for $85 in upstate New York, so it is the same thing and it isn't. There is talk that when the former Debbie Reynolds Hotel gets torn down, they'll make it a wrestling angle and have Austin blow it up, with the idea that Austin just blew up a multi-million-dollar piece of property owned by McMahon. Shamrock will be holding a grand opening of his new Lion's Den in San Diego to the public on March 13, using his brother Robbie Kilpatrick as the head instructor. Livewire on March 6 did a 2.2 and Superstars on March 7 did a 2.1 rating. The readers' pages. Flair. I'm a bit disappointed in the David Flair scenarios. I remember Mike Von Erich, Chris Von Erich, and Eric Watts, and this is going down the same road. I wish Ric Flair would see what is happening and not proceed with this angle, because it's only going to work against him. I'm also disappointed in the Nitro where Chris Benoit had to suffer 2 pinfall losses on the same show. I thought for sure after losing the tag match that he'd get it back by beating Scott Hall, but I guess the Clique continues to rule the promotion. Is China wearing those smaller white suits rather than the black suits a symbol that DX was bad and Vince is good? The year-end awards were good and I'm in agreement with all of them except the same category where I had a problem last year. Like last year's Diamond Cutter, the Rocks People/Corporate Elbow had to be one of the worst choices around. Do readers really want to see that rather than some skillful innovative move? I guess so, but it's beyond me. Mick Foley was on TSN's Off the Record. It was one of the most interesting ones to date. He was totally out of character and gave people a new insight into mankind in an honest, believable way. It strengthened one's belief that he is there to entertain the fans and give them their money's worth. The only troubling part is when he was stating that he would never do anything where he would get seriously injured and that he maps out a lot in his mind ahead of time. How can you avoid injury taking suicidal baseball swing like chair shots to the head? Grant Swarich. Peterborough, Ontario. WCW Telemundo. I just saw the WCW debut show on Telemundo. The show content was such a waste for a great television outlet. The show might as well have been called WCW Worldwide in Spanish. The show wasn't even listed in the TV guide or in the local newspaper listings. The only thing I found redeeming about the show is Connon's announcing. He did an excellent job calling the matches. He might have a future career in being the equivalent to Mike Tenay. My suggestion is for WCW to attempt to salvage this show. This can be accomplished by taking the WWF approach and taping a few exclusive matches before Nitro. That way there is something fresh for the show and there are a base of wrestlers that could be pushed primarily for this show. Most American fans aren't going to have the attention span to watch the luchadores do their own style or a lucha-oriented show under the WCW name. Another idea would be to tape the show every 3 or 4 weeks in Tijuana. The audience there is familiar with the wrestlers. They appreciate and understand the style and the audience reaction is usually hot as hell. The environment with the right production can come across as a really hot television show. I can't figure out the salary structure at WCW. I know the salaries can be placed on several books or they can be justified in supplying highly rated programs. By having high contracts, it discourages talent from jumping to the WWF. But my question is, how do they figure on how some of these wrestlers deserve these contracts? Why does Diamond Dallas Page deserve a contract in the $2 million range? It's not like he's a wrestler that the company should desperately not want to go to the WWF. He's never drawn big money or a big buy rate on his own. At times it seems like the only reason he's even accepted as a main eventer is because he's been programmed in a top spot for so long that people finally accepted him in it. I think the role Bret Hart has been put in over the last few months has devalued his drawing power and stature. All of the effort they made to sign him has turned out to be worthless since they had no idea how to use him. As sad as this sounds after watching Wrestling with Shadows, maybe Hart should consider going back to the WWF in a few years. I know it sounds ludicrous and will probably never happen, but Vince McMahon has a better idea how to use Bret Hart than WCW. Bret Hart not being placed in a more prominent role in WCW has been ludicrous. Why does Scott Hall deserve a raise? His main event days have been over for a long time. If the idea is to keep him from going to WWF, then that can be the only justification. Why does WCW insist on overpaying wrestlers whose money-drawing days are long gone? Kurt Hennig isn't the same worker and can't draw at all. The $750,000 for him could have been used more effectively for younger talent. The money and the push he was given could have at least been justified if he was interesting. Barry Windham is just as valuable and probably receives less money. WCW is overpaying wrestlers who will never draw the money that's invested in them. The few who can draw the money should be pushed to justify their salaries. By overpaying so many wrestlers, the result will probably cause the lower level guys to want more money. You can't blame lower wrestlers for wanting more as there is such a salary discrepancy already. Eric Bimbin. Howard Beach, New York. Response from Dave Meltzer: I'd hate to categorize many wrestlers as being overpaid when WCW only pays maybe 20% or less of its income to salaries of talent, and other sports pay 50 to 65%. Salaries in all sports aren't fair, and certainly that can be said for WCW. But if there are overpaid wrestlers, and I'd agree there are a few, they number far less than underpaid wrestlers. A case in point with Page. If you were to say that Page on the salary structure should be, let's say, number 10 in the company, I'd bet salary doesn't compare with the 10th highest paid guy on a baseball team or football team that takes in far less money per year than WCW does. NWA: the statement that I resigned from the NWA Board of Directors because I was to relinquish the rights to promote the NWA World Tag Team Champions throughout the NWA and its membership that purportedly numbers 22. The last listing I received was as of August 18, 1998. Is nothing but an out-and-out lie. I hope you allow me to respond because NWA President Howard Brody and his board need to be set straight once and for all, and my fellow NWA members need to be smarted up to what's being done by this congregation of misdirection. The reason, and believe me, there are hundreds, that I resigned from the NWA board was not because I wouldn't do the right thing. The time-honored tradition, etc. I knew on October 23, 1998, that day before we would be awarded the belts, that we would be doing the time-honored thing in January or February. No problem. Never was a problem. The NWA president and his thinking of angles before dotting the I's is and will continue to be my biggest problem and probably led to me resigning from the board more than anything else. Please allow me to pass along a scouting report to Mr. Inoki on his NWA business partners. 1. NWA President Howard Brody doesn't broker enough shows a year to satisfy his gigantic need to come up with real angles on his own promotions, so is continually fantasizing about elaborate inter-promotional angles. He needs to become the NWA president and not an ass-kisser to other promotions. Be careful. Sometimes you get what you want. 2. NWA Vice President Bill Behrens. Mr. Behrens recently responded to my concerns on our website by responding simply, "I'm doing what I can. I have a life beyond wrestling." This is from the NWA Vice President. He is a lot like a gentleman I used to work for in New Jersey. He gets some lame double-taking excuse for just about everything. I sent him a FedEx delivery of a video cassette featuring the NWA Tag Team Champions. Before I sent this, I asked what format. He responded he had to ask someone and he'd get back to me. He then said Super VHS was sufficient, so I went him a Super VHS tape. Later I was awakened that we had a problem with the tape. He could hear it perfectly but the tracking was off. He actually tried to play it in his VCR. This is from the man who runs NWA Worldwide Wrestling. How can you call yourself NWA Worldwide Wrestling without ever booking the NWA World Champions in any division? Is NWA Music City? Live with the truth and be proud of what you are instead of trying to position yourself as the NWA television show. That Super VHS tape was never used, and the reason Worldwide Bill gave, once again his own words, "We have not yet wanted to incur the cost of a transfer." Are you kidding? The cost would be approximately $20. So what it means is if it was a regular VHS tape, NWA Worldwide would have been able to air it, but NWA Worldwide didn't want to go to such a great expense to transfer customized footage of his World Tag Team Champions. 3. Former Vice President Dennis Corraluzzo books more NWA shows than anybody when he's not defending himself from President Brody's charges that range from A to Z, but he has also yet to book the NWA World Tag Team Champions, even though the champions are easily within driving distance of all his shows. 4 and 5. Steve Rickard and Victor Quiñones. First, let me say I have a great deal of respect for these two men's wrestling business expertise and could learn a lot from both of them. But NWA board members need to be active in the NWA business, not just figureheads. Mr. Rickard is a true legend, but that was a long time ago and now is so far out of the loop it isn't funny. Up until recently, when a motion I made was supported by a board vote, a board member could have multiple votes of proxy, and Mr. Rickard and Mr. Quiñones' votes were always controlled by the NWA president. The funny thing is, when I contacted Mr. Rickard about NWA board business, he was surprised to know that I was a member, and even more surprised I was a board member. Through correspondence with Mr. Corraluzzo, Mr. Rickard had displayed anger toward the board for lack of attempting to get his votes on anything for a very long time. As far as Mr. Quiñones is concerned, he works for the WWF and to the best of my knowledge has not promoted or brokered an NWA event. As far as I know, he has no knowledge of any NWA business at all. His position on the board was lobbied by the NWA president for the dual purpose of controlling another vote and kissing the WWF's ass. Mr. Quiñones was not even at the NWA 50th anniversary convention and its membership meeting in October. 6. This brings me to the final member and the easiest to figure out, Ernie Todd of Winnipeg. Without Mr. Todd coming to the rescue of the NWA 50th anniversary show and paying the ridiculous police detail at the above-mentioned ill-fated and embarrassing event, this is a whole different can of worms. It would have never taken place. Good or bad, you can make that determination yourself. Refund Mr. Todd for his generous and tremendous gift. Thank him privately. Thank him publicly if need be. But to make him an NWA board member, you have got to be kidding me when you have real promoters like Greg Price, who has since left the NWA, Ken Taylor, Jim Miller and others. This is another vote that Mr. President controls. In closing this little scouting report, let me say to Mr. Inoki, when you have had enough laughs, give me a call and maybe, just maybe, we will be able to resurrect this great organization for the new millennium. I will be accepting any NWA members and will be recruiting other promoters across the country that would like to make the phrase tradition rules throughout our business. At the NWA 51st convention, we will be in attendance and we will make the NWA the #1 priority, not business dealings on foreign lands or promoting with the larger WWF and WCW that benefits nobody but the deal maker. Although we admire the current NWA World Champion Dan Severn, we will no longer recognize him as our champion. NWA/America will be holding a one-night tournament on May 22, 1999 to decide the NWA/America World Champion. Any NWA regional champion will be allowed in. NWA/America will continue to recognize current NWA World Tag Team Champions The Brotherhood and NWA NE Junior Heavyweight Champion Louis Ortiz as the NWA/America World Junior Heavyweight Champion. I probably would have been thwarted in this attempt if Mother Nature didn't step in with a little help in the form of a blizzard that shut down the airport on our way to Dallas on February 25th and February 26th to do the right thing. Fate and history sometimes takes care of a lot of decisions. After hearing from Brody and Barons regarding the status of the NWA World Tag Team titles, that the titles were going to be held up due to us not being able to fly out of Boston to Dallas on February 26th, I've decided this letter needs to be seen. Let me leave you with this question. When was the last time a national promotion held up a title because the champions were snowed in and couldn't get to the regional promoters show? What leadership and decision-making skills are being displayed by Brody and Barons? Answer is the same for both. None. Anthony Maliaro aka Tony Rumble. NWA/America/New England. Wrestler of the Decade. While Manami Toyota should certainly be high on any list for Wrestler of the Decade, she is definitely not number one. Besides her lack of drawing power, she has several flaws that would prevent her from being number one even if ring work was the only criterion. Toyota has inarguably the best work rate ever, maybe including the men. But she has been weak in areas like selling and transitions. She may have some of the best spots, but if spots were all that mattered, people would still be raving about Sabu and Rob Van Dam would really be the whole effing show. Another problem with Toyota is that she hasn't compensated for her age. As she has slowed down, she hasn't made the proper adjustments. Compare her to Jushin Liger or Ultimo Dragon. As they grew older and lost some speed, they compensated by incorporating more psychology. Liger may not do a shooting star press anymore, but his matches are even better today than when he was in his prime as a flyer. He has taken the best elements of the All Japan style and combined it with carefully chosen high spots to make for great matches. These matches may not have the craziest high spots, or even the best work rate, but they are more solid across the board. As Toyota has gotten older, she still relies on her athleticism, and it hasn't worked. If she tried to improve in other areas and became a better all-around performer, her aging would be less noticeable. This is not to say Toyota is not one of the best wrestlers ever. She is one of the greatest performers of all time, and she belongs near the top in Wrestler of the Decade voting. Her list of great matches can rival anyone's. Personally, I'm a big fan of hers, but I think it's unfair to glorify her but crucify others for the same things. My personal choice for Wrestler of the Decade is Mitsuharu Misawa. He is the wrestler of the 90s the way Ric Flair was in the 80s, and then some. Nobody combines psychology, selling, and work rate as well. He can build a match better than anyone I've ever seen. Every move in his matches means something, whether it's a simple elbow of a tiger driver. It doesn't matter if his match lasts 7 minutes or 70. Every move will fit into the storyline. Who else could have followed the most innovative light heavyweight, Satoru Sayama, and then gone on to become the best heavyweight worker in the world? Of course, it hasn't hurt Misawa to work with guys like Kenta Kobashi and Toshiaki Kawada, who are both also good candidates for Wrestler of the Decade. But if you look at the greatest of the All Japan matches, the common thread has been Misawa. All the other names you mentioned are also good choice, but all fall short of Misawa. The closest would be Liger. He's a junior heavyweight version of Misawa. Those two are the real total packages in wrestling, combining excellent spots with chess master psychology and outstanding selling. The North American candidates include Shawn Michaels, Bret Hart, Steve Austin, Vader, and Ric Flair. None of these are even close to Misawa. Flair's match quality has declined considerably, although even at 50 years old he can still have a good match. Vader may have been revitalized in All Japan, but for the last 3 years, he was terribly misused. That's not his fault, but it does hurt him. Austin may be the best draw, and he's had some great matches, but his work isn't even close to Misawa's. Michaels and Hart have had the best matches of this bunch, but neither can stack up next to Misawa. Michaels oversells everything and has hardly been an ideal professional employee. Hart's matches are all too similar. They both are, or at least were, great, but Misawa was better. I do have to wonder where Chris Benoit would have fit in had he stayed in Japan, or been pushed properly in the United States. He is probably the best pure worker in the world, and if he had the time to stretch his matches out, he could have incorporated better psychology. Again, it's not his fault, but it does eliminate seriously considering him for Wrestler of the Decade. Russell Darlington. Beckley, West Virginia. Response from Dave Meltzer, being that Toyota was in probably the best single match I ever saw live when it comes from every aspect of wrestling, including psychology, selling, transitions, high spots, drama and emotion like you'd never believe unless you were there live. her hair versus hair match with Toshio Yamada in 1992, I'd really argue the point about her being weak in selling and transitions. I agree that she's lost a lot in recent years because she relied so heavily on her athletic ability, and as she's slowed down, it's become obvious she can't match her past, unlike Liger or Misawa, who as they got older became completely different style wrestlers. She was a fantastic worker, maybe the best I ever saw, at the style that was in vogue in 1992. She got older and the style and mentality of the fans changed, so she was over the last year or two doing somewhat of a dated style, and she, without changing, was doing too many high spots in a match, and all the same spots she'd been doing for years, and it caught up. The more I think about Wrestler of the Decade, the more I think it's Misawa by a pretty substantial margin. But even though Misawa's peak matches were every bit as good, and maybe better than Flair's, although both were the peak workers of their era, and Misawa's edge is more that 90s style was more advanced, and not that Misawa stood out above the pack any more than Flair did. I'd rate Flair in the 80s as superior overall because Flair was more consistent, carried more poor opponents to great matches, and Flair was far superior as a personality. Misawa, once he was pushed to the top, was always promoted almost perfectly, which is an edge he had over Flair, who rarely was. Regarding my letter in the February 8th issue in your reply, it seems I was wrong in that Manami Toyota can't be the Wrestler of the Decade because apparently not enough people have t-shirts with her name on it. I assume it is safe to say she is the most outstanding Wrestler of the Decade, a category that I believe doesn't require massive sales of CDs but is based on in-ring ability. John Castles. Stockport, England. Observer. Let me buffer my criticism by first stating that I normally enjoy your writing, in particular the obituaries that have unfortunately become commonplace in wrestling, but your satirical comments toward WCW lately have gone over the line. The February 22nd issue stands out in particular. I, along with a number of your readers, may very well know that the direction the company is taking right now just isn't working, but to constantly drone on that. Twice you referred to Nitro as a nightmare and frequently ridiculed the people who conceived of the skits. Anyone who saw the shows knew they were bad, so why beat on a dead horse? Why do you even review the shows? You don't review All Japan and New Japan TV shows in their news section. I don't know about your other readers, but I'm dreadfully tired of reading about shows I've already seen. How about putting them in a section like the All Japan and New Japan reviews? Eric Coville. State College, Pennsylvania. Mushnick/Baba. The recent deaths of Sam Mushnick and Giant Baba brought to an end an era. Mushnick and Baba promoted wrestling the way I think it should be promoted. They didn't believe in gimmicks and tried to make it as close to real as possible, which is a far cry from today's promoters. When Mushnick promoted in St. Louis, he didn't have ladder matches or scaffold matches. He never had the NWA title change hands in a gimmick match. Could you imagine him having the title change hands when the challenger pinned the champion by using a forklift? It's ridiculous. Could you imagine Mushnick having a clown like Mankind as his world champion? For all the praise he gets in The Observer, I think he's nothing more than a frustrated stunt man. If he wants to do high-risk stunts, he should work in the movies. Falling through tables and jumping off the top of cages through tables has nothing to do with wrestling. In the old days, gimmick wrestlers were kept on the undercard, not made into world champions. I wish someone with a lot of money would come along and promote wrestling the way it used to be. Of course, that will probably never happen considering the fact Vince McMahon has already taken it beyond any sense of credibility. Dwayne Mason. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Response from Dave Meltzer: history is great to learn from, but history's greatest lesson is that everything must change in wrestling or go stale. As said before, there are parts of the art form that have been lost and parts that have been gained with all the recent changes, and the current scene necessitates changes being faster than ever before. Wrestling is whatever the public buys under the heading. There are no rules to what it is and isn't, other than if a promoter is doing a concept that doesn't work, he won't last. If a promotion can be profitable running pure shoots, then that is a form of pro wrestling, even if the most basic component of what we grew up with as pro wrestling, planned high spots and finishes, aren't part of the art form. If a promotion can be profitable with people jumping through tables and cutting each other up and doing no psychology nor doing anything within the realm of believability, doing anything that takes athletic talent, that's still pro wrestling, even if it wasn't wrestling some of us grew up with. Mushnick and Baba deserve a lot of praise for being great promoters for their day, and being more honest than almost all in a dishonest profession. That doesn't make their style right for today, or the only correct style even if their day, and other styles wrong. It just makes their style successful in the time and place it was presented in. There are concepts you can learn from both men's shows and adapt them to today's scene if done with the right people that would probably still be successful, but just because there are concepts they didn't do, particularly if they work as entertainment to today's audience, even if they have no believability, doesn't make them wrong or not pro wrestling. Because if there's one thing today's promoters have proven, is the mindset of the 70s and early 80s, that if the general public doesn't believe it to be real, that the entire business would die, has turned out to be the biggest fallacy of all. Raw. While I can understand most readers' distaste for Nitro, it also seems as if many people are watching Raw with blinders on. Take Vince McMahon's character out of the picture and you are left with a show almost as dull as WCW Saturday Night. Vince McMahon a marketing genius? Aren't we forgetting this is the same guy who debuted Steve Austin as the ringmaster? Like WCW, McMahon had squandered top talent and created virtually no new stars, other than himself, Chyna, Val Venis, and Sable. Chyna gets over as an anomaly, not because of good booking. We all know why Sable is over. Venis was given a can't-miss gimmick, but he's been turned so many times fans are getting bored with him. Now they're doing the same thing with Undertaker. Look at Shamrock. That one should have been easy. He missed the boat on Vader, Scorpio, Brian Christopher, Taka Michinoku, Owen Hart, the Hardy Boys and the Brood. They all could have been rising stars. Instead he pushes stiffs like the Oddities, the Acolytes, DOA, Midian, Viscera, Droz, Goldust, and Gilbert. Vince threw so many gimmicks at Cactus that it was inevitable the crowd would like one of them. Ditto for Mark Henry. How that demonstrates creative genius is beyond me. DX began as nothing more than a copy of the NWO, and that's really all the corporation is now. The heel owner gimmick was handed to him on a silver platter. The Giant is a creation of WCW. Sean Waltman would never be over as much as he is if not for his tenure in WCW. Nobody would care about Road Dogg if he didn't do impressions. Nobody does care about Billy Gunn. I'll admit, I watch Raw more than Nitro because it has more logical storylines, and Nitro lately has been abysmal. But Raw is hardly a great 2 hours. And before fans target WCW for dropping angles without explanation, explain to me how Shawn Michaels went from being left laying with his face in a windshield to being a babyface commissioner without even acknowledging wanting revenge, or even anyone mentioning the attack. Paul Armentano. Silver Spring, Maryland. Response from Dave Meltzer: WWF is great right now, as promoting the concepts they understand. And really that's all any great organization does. The company doesn't know how to push concepts that have worked elsewhere because they are so busy trying to compete rather than find out what's going on elsewhere. They lucked out with Austin, but at least when he caught fire, they did a great job in pushing him to the top rather than cutting him off. They didn't understand how to push Shamrock from the beginning because that's not a kind of wrestling they understand. Ditto Taka and Christopher. They cut Scorpio off early, and he in turn went into the tank and was too far gone when they made one too weak attempt at salvaging him. They did a tremendous job with Mick Foley, particularly since that isn't the kind of wrestler that company would have pushed in the past, and everyone can come up with a zillion reasons why he shouldn't headline, except none of those reasons mean a thing because he is headlining and it works. Not every gimmick works, and mistakes have been made with certain characters and weighing down the roster with charismatically challenged and work rate challenged big guys, but you can't knock that the overall product right now is a major success.